Hello everyone, I know this is a different upload than usual, but today, June 30th, is the 2-year anniversary of the start of Rewriting History. For some of my new viewers, Rewriting History was a series where I took each season of NASCAR prior to 1975 and gave it a consistent points format. I figured since most of those videos are less than 5 or 6 minutes each, I figured why not match it up into one big video. So with that being said, enjoy. Over the course of NASCAR's history, we have had many different ways of crowning a champion, whether it's the Winston Cup format, the chase, or heck, even the playoffs. But in the early days of the sport, the way of deciding a champion would be quite inconsistent. In the early days, it would be based on how much money one driver made, the amount of laps one driver completed, but the problem with all of these is that there was no source of consistency. But today, we're going to start a new series on my channel called Rewriting History. This will be a series where I break down every season from 1949 to 1974 and give the series a legitimate format. This will basically be the Latford point system, or better known as the Winston Cup format, but with a twist. First place will still get 175 points and count down by 5 until 6th, which gets 150 points. Then count down by 4 until you get to 11th, which gets 130 points. Then count down by 3 until you get to 25th, which gets 88 points. Then count down by 2 until you get to 54th, which gets 30 points, and finally count down by 1 until you get down to 83rd, which will receive 1 point. Also, there will still be points for leading laps. This is done to accommodate for the larger field sizes back in the early days. To lay out some ground rules, to be counted for the season, I will be using what is known as the Kyle Busch rule. This is where you have to run 70% of the real-life champions races in that given season. Now you may be asking why 70%? Because Kyle Busch won the championship in 2015 despite running only 25 of 36 races. In other words, around 70% of the schedule. So with all that out of the way, let's get into it. In 1949, there would only be 15 full-time drivers. Red Byron, Tim Flock, Fonty Flock, Bob Flock, Lee Petty, Bill Blair, Curtis Turner, Sarah Christian, Glenn Dunaway, Herb Thomas, Bill Snowden, Frank Mundy, Slick Smith, Ray Erickson, and Otis Martin. In the opening 4 races of the inaugural season, there would be 3 full-time winners. Red Byron would take the win at Daytona Beach, with Bob Flock taking the win at Hillsboro and Curtis Turner taking race 4 at Langhorne. So already halfway through the season, Red Byron would have the points lead over Bill Blair, Tim Flock, and Bob Flock. Already in NASCAR's first season, we would have a really close championship battle. So going into race 5, only one driver would show up, and that would be Glenn Dunaway, who would slice his gap down to just 145 points. Keep this in mind. At the next race at Martinsville, Red Byron would win, but we would lose contenders in Tim Flock and Bob Flock, who decided to not show up. With Byron winning, this put him 45 points ahead of Bill Blair, who now seemed to be his only rival. But neither driver would participate in the next race at Pittsburgh, and this would have major implications. Lee Petty and Glenn Dunaway would both show up, and Lee Petty would win the race and would cut the gap from 231 points to just 46 points. It was now in contention for the title. And Glenn Dunaway, despite having a mediocre 18th place finish, would cut his gap from 184 points to 75 points. Going into the final race, we would have had a 4-way title fight in NASCAR's inaugural season, but Red Byron had to finish 8th or better in order to clinch the championship. But in the final race of the season at North Wilkesboro, Red Byron would have an abysmal race, finishing in 16th, while 3rd place in the standings Lee Petty would go on to finish in 2nd. This would be enough for Lee Petty to claim the championship by 9 points over Red Byron, and he would rewrite history as being the champion in NASCAR's inaugural season and not Red Byron. So already, there would be some major changes. Lee Petty would claim title number 1 in NASCAR's inaugural season, and Red Byron would just kind of be an afterthought. And with history already being rewritten, who knows what else could change over the next 25 years. In 1950, there would be 9 full-time drivers: Bill Rexford, Curtis Turner, Lee Petty, Tim Flock, Herb Thomas, Bill Blair, Chuck Mahoney, Dick Linder, and Lloyd Moore. In the first 5 races of the season, there would only be 3 full-time winners. Tim Flock would win the second race of the season at Charlotte, with Curtis Turner winning back-to-back races at Langhorne and Martinsville, and Bill Rexford would take race 5 at Canfield. So already a quarter of the way into the season, we would have 5 drivers in contention for the title: Lloyd Moore, Tim Flock, Curtis Turner, Lee Petty, and Bill Rexford. At race 6 in Vernon, neither Tim Flock or Curtis Turner would participate, and this would hand second to Lee Petty, who finished 5th and was now 71 points behind. Bill Rexford finished 6th and was now 156 points back in 3rd. Tim Flock would drop to 4th and was now 189 points behind, and Curtis Turner would now be 5th, 196 points back. At Dayton, Lloyd Moore would have a horrible 23rd place finish, while Lee Petty would cut the gap down to 23 points with an 8th place finish. Bill Rexford would finish 10th and was now 116 points back. Curtis Turner, who finished 4th, was now 120 points behind. And Tim Flock, who didn't participate, would drop out of contention. At Monroe, Moore would have a 7th place finish, while Lee Petty would have a 3rd place finish and cut the gap to just 4 points. Curtis Turner would win the race and move into 3rd and was now 81 points behind. Bill Rexford would finish 5th and was now 4th, 107 points back. At Charlotte, Lloyd Moore finished 21st and would drop to 3rd in the standings, 26 points behind new leader Lee Petty, who finished 11th. Curtis Turner would win the race and was now 2nd, 22 points behind. Bill Rexford would finish 19th and was now 127 points behind in 4th. At Hillsborough, the lead would swap hands again with Curtis Turner finishing 2nd while Lee Petty finished 7th. And with Lloyd Moore not participating in the race, this would drop him out of contention. So halfway through the season, we would have a 3-way title fight between Curtis Turner, Lee Petty, and Bill Rexford. At the next race in Dayton, Curtis Turner would finish 23rd, while Lee Petty would finish 4th and was now 49 points behind Petty. Bill Rexford finished 14th and was now 152 points back. At Hamburg, Curtis Turner would finish 3rd and took the lead back by 37 points over Petty, who finished 27th. Bill Rexford finished 6th and was now 123 points behind. At the Southern 500, Curtis Turner would have an abysmal day, finishing 60th, while Lee Petty would finish 6th and would take the lead back by 76 points over Bill Rexford and 84 points over Turner. At Langhorne, Lee Petty would finish 4th and would solidify his lead, while Curtis Turner would finish 24th and drift further away from contention. With 5 races to go, Lee Petty seemed to have a strong hold on the championship, and it would take a miracle for either Turner or Rexford to catch him. At North Wilkesboro, Curtis Turner would be the only contender to participate and would fail to make the most of it and only finish 22nd and cut the gap down to 51 points. At Vernon, Lee Petty would finish 7th while Rexford finished 6th and cut the gap to 90 points. And Curtis Turner would not participate and would fall out of contention. At Martinsville, Lee Petty would finish 2nd while Rexford would not participate and would now be 260 points behind. At the penultimate race in Winchester, Rexford finished 3rd, while Petty would be the one to not participate, and would cut the gap to just 95 points going into the finale at Hillsborough. Lee Petty just needed a 24th place finish, but in the finale, Lee Petty would assert dominance and win the race while Rexford finished 26th, and Lee Petty would go back-to-back and win NASCAR's first 2 championships. So already, Lee Petty would be the NASCAR's first 2-time champion, a title that in real life belongs to Herb Thomas, and he would also be the first back-to-back champion, a title that belongs to Buck Baker in real life. So in just the first 2 episodes, so much had already changed. Red Byron and Bill Rexford would both be stripped of their titles, and who knows who else could benefit or who else could lose from this series. In NASCAR's 3rd season, we would only have 6 full-time drivers: 2-time defending champion Lee Petty, Tim Flock, Herb Thomas, Fonty Flock, Lloyd Moore, and Frank Mundy. In the first 8 races, we would only have 2 full-time winners, with Tim Flock winning race 3 at Mobile, and Fonty Flock would win race 5 at Hillsborough and race 7 at North Wilkesboro. So after 8 races, Fonty Flock would lead the standings by 41 points over brother Tim Flock and would be 176 points over Herb Thomas. At Canfield, Fonty Flock would finish 3rd, while Tim would finish 2nd and would shrink the gap to 36 points. At Columbus, Tim Flock would win the race and take the point lead by 51 points over Fonty, who finished 25th. At Columbia, Tim Flock would finish 7th while brother Fonty would finish 12th and would stretch the gap to 70 points. At Dayton, Tim Flock would finish 3rd while Fonty would finish 4th and grow the gap to 80 points. Fast forward 3 races to Bainbridge, Fonty Flock would win the race and would regain the points lead by 2 points over Tim. At Pittsburgh, Fonty Flock finished 36th, while Tim would come home 37th, and with Herb Thomas winning the race, the championship picture would end up being a 3-horse race between the Flock brothers and Herb Thomas. At race 17 in Weaverville, Fonty Flock would win the race while brother Tim would finish 11th and would grow the gap to 54 points, while Herb Thomas would finish 3rd and was now 129 points back. At Rochester, Fonty would finish 14th, while Tim would not participate and would now be 185 points back, and Herb Thomas, who finished 15th, would move into 2nd place and was now 142 points behind. At Altamont, Tim Flock would not participate again and would now be out of contention. Meanwhile, Fonty Flock would win the race while Herb Thomas would finish 2nd and was now 157 points behind. At Detroit, Flock would finish 35th while Thomas would finish 57th, and the gap would increase to 203 points. At Toledo, Herb Thomas would finish 5th while Flock would finish 18th and would cut the gap to 167 points. At Morristown, the gap would be extended to 170 points. At Airbase, shout out to Slapshoes, Flock would finish 4th while Thomas would finish 6th and would increase the gap to 180 points. At the Southern 500, Herb Thomas would dominate the race and win while Flock would finish 8th, and with 17 races to go, the gap would be 137 points. At Columbia, Flock would finish 10th while Thomas would finish 20th and would grow the gap to 168 points. At Macon, Thomas would win while Flock would finish 4th and would shrink the gap to 148 points. Skip ahead 4 races to Wilson, where Flock would win the race while Thomas would finish 14th and would extend the gap to 202 points. At Hillsboro, Thomas would win the race while Flock would finish 15th and would shrink the gap to 150 points. At Thompson, Thomas would finish 26th while Flock would not participate, and with 9 races left, the gap would only be 64 points. Fast forward to race 34 at Martinsville, Herb Thomas would finish 18th while Flock would not participate and would give the point lead to Thomas by 40 points. At Oakland, Flock would finish 11th while Thomas would not participate and would take the lead back by 90 points. At North Wilkesboro, Fonty Flock would win the race while Thomas would finish 21st and would extend the gap to 170 points. At Hanford, Flock would finish 24th while Thomas would finish 28th and would increase the gap to 179 points. At Jacksonville, Thomas would win the race while Flock would finish 3rd and would decrease the gap to 159 points. At Atlanta, Thomas would finish 19th while Flock would miss the race and the gap was now only 53 points. In the penultimate race of the season at Jardina, Flock would finish 11th while Thomas would not participate, and this would give Fonty Flock a 188-point lead, and this would be enough for Flock to lock the championship up a race early. And in the finale at Mobile, Flock would finish 4th while Thomas would finish a disappointing 21st, and Fonty Flock would go down as the 1951 champion and take away Herb Thomas's first title. So in 3 seasons, the results would be different in all 3, with Lee Petty claiming championship 1 and 2, and Fonty Flock winning the 3rd one in 1951. Also, think about what this would do for Fonty Flock's legacy. Fonty is currently not in the Hall of Fame, but I guarantee you if he had won this championship, he would be a NASCAR Hall of Famer. In 1952, we would only have 5 full-time drivers: defending champion Fonty Flock, Herb Thomas, 2-time champion Lee Petty, Tim Flock, and Dick Rathman. In the opening 7 races, only 3 were won by contenders. Tim Flock would win the season opener at West Palm Beach, with Herb Thomas winning North Wilkesboro, and Dick Rathman winning the race at Martinsville. So after 7 races, the 1949 and 1950 champion Lee Petty would lead the standings by 112 points over Herb Thomas. At Macon, Lee Petty would finish 7th, while Herb Thomas would win the race and cut the gap down to 78 points. At Langhorne, Lee Petty would finish 3rd, while Thomas would finish 21st and would slip back to 3rd, 153 points behind. Defending champion Fonty Flock would move into 2nd, 110 points back. At Darlington, Lee Petty would finish 7th, while Fonty Flock would finish the race in 3rd and would cut the gap to 91 points. At Dayton, Petty would finish 4th, while Flock would finish 11th and would grow the gap to 121 points. At Canfield, Lee Petty would have an abysmal 23rd place finish, while Fonty Flock would finish 17th. It was now 4th, 103 points back. Tim Flock would move to 2nd, 85 points back, with a 4th place finish. Herb Thomas would win the race and was now 99 points back in 3rd. At Toledo, Lee Petty would have a solid third place finish while Tim Flock would go on and win the race, and after 14 races, we would have a four-way battle for the championship. At Hillsboro, Petty would finish 6th while Tim Flock would win and would shrink the gap to 40 points. At Charlotte, Petty would finish 4th while Flock would finish 2nd and would close the gap to 30 points. At Detroit, Lee Petty would lose the lead with a 32nd place finish, while Tim Flock would win the race and take the point lead by 76 points over Petty. At Niagara Falls, Tim Flock would finish 13th while Petty would finish 16th, and Petty was now 3rd, 85 points back. Herb Thomas would move into 2nd with a 2nd place finish. He was now 48 points behind. At Tioga, Tim Flock would win while Thomas would finish 2nd and slightly increase the gap to 53 points. At Monroe, we would have the exact same result and the gap would grow to 58 points. At Morristown, Thomas would finish 24th. It was now 137 points back in 3rd, while Tim Flock would finish 2nd, and Lee Petty would move to 2nd in the standings, 105 points back. At South Bend, Flock would win the race, while Petty would finish 2nd and would grow the gap to 120 points. At Rochester, Flock would win again, while Petty would finish 4th. It was now 140 points back. At Weaverville, Petty would not participate while Flock would finish 2nd and grew the gap to a whopping 310 points. At the Southern 500, Lee Petty would finish 6th while Flock would finish 33rd and would shrink the gap to 232 points. At Macon, Lee Petty would win again while Flock finished 3rd. It was now 227 points back. At Langhorne, Petty would win again while Flock would finish 4th, decreasing the gap to 212 points. At Dayton, Flock would finish 6th while Petty would finish 2nd, and with 6 races left, it would take nothing short of a miracle for Petty to overtake Flock. At Wilson, Petty would finish 2nd while Flock would finish 7th and would shrink the gap to 163 points. At Hillsboro, Flock would finish 4th and Petty 5th, growing the gap to 168 points. At Martinsville, Petty would finish 3rd and Flock 4th, and shrunk the gap to 163 points. At North Wilkesboro, Flock would finish 4th while Petty would finish 13th and would grow the gap to 199 points. In the penultimate race of the season at Atlanta, Petty needed a miracle, and even with a 2nd place finish, Tim Flock would finish 4th and the gap was now down to 184 points. All Flock had to do was finish 83rd, but with the field size only being 19 cars in the finale, Flock would win the championship a week early and would cap off his championship winning season with a 12th place finish. So either way, Tim Flock would claim the 1952 season, and this is actually the first season where the real-life champion is the same as our timeline of champions. Tim Flock was just simply better than everybody else, and he would beat a 2-time champion in our timeline, and was so dominant that he was able to lock up the title a week early. In 1953, there would only be 6 full-time drivers: Dick Rathman, 2-time champion Lee Petty, 1951 champion Fonty Flock, Herb Thomas, Buck Baker, and defending champion Tim Flock. In the opening 6 races, we would only have 2 full-time winners. Lee Petty would win the season opener at West Palm Beach, and then again in race 6 at Richmond. Herb Thomas would win race 3 at Spring Lake and would go back-to-back by winning at North Wilkesboro. So after 6 races, we would already have the 3 heavy hitters of Herb Thomas, Dick Rathman, and Lee Petty. At race 7 in Macon, Dick Rathman would win the race while Herb Thomas would finish 2nd, and the gap was now 18 points. Lee Petty would finish 19th and would now be 150 points back. At Langhorne, Thomas would finish 7th while Rathman would finish 16th, growing the gap to 54 points. And Petty would finish 2nd, shrinking his gap to 126 points. At Columbia, Thomas would finish 8th while Rathman would finish 16th, once again growing the gap to 81 points. Lee Petty would finish 5th and was now 113 points back. At Hickory, Thomas would finish a disappointing 20th while Rathman would finish 5th and shrink the gap to 29 points. Lee Petty would finish 15th and was now 98 points back. At Martinsville, Thomas would finish 2nd while Rathman would finish 3rd. It was now 44 points back. And Lee Petty's gap, despite winning the race, would flatline to 98 points. At Columbus, Herb Thomas would win the race, and after 12 races, he would have the point lead over Dick Rathman and Lee Petty. At race 13 in Raleigh, Thomas would finish 4th while Rathman would finish 6th, and Rathman was now behind by 64 points. Lee Petty would finish 8th and was now 154 points back. At Shreveport, Rathman, despite finishing ahead of Thomas, he would lose points and was now 69 points back. Petty would win the race and would only cut the gap to 149 points. At Pensacola, Thomas would win the race while Rathman finished 2nd and was now 74 points back. Petty would finish 3rd and was now 159 points behind. At Langhorne, Rathman would win while Thomas would finish 4th and would shrink the gap to 49 points. Petty finished 2nd and the gap was now back to 149 points. At High Point, Herb Thomas would win while Rathman finished 2nd and was now 64 points behind. Lee Petty would finish 5th and was now 179 points back. At Wilson, Rathman would finish 2nd and Thomas 3rd, and halfway through the season, it seemed like it was going to be a showdown between the Hudson Hornet of Herb Thomas and Dick Rathman. At Rochester, Thomas would win the race while Rathman finished 2nd and grew the gap to 74 points. At Spartanburg, Thomas would finish 3rd while Rathman finished 10th, and the gap was now 105 points. At Morristown, Dick Rathman would win the race while Thomas would finish 2nd and was now 95 points back. At Atlanta, Thomas would win while Rathman finished 2nd, growing the gap to 105 points. At Rapid City, Thomas would win again and Rathman finished 2nd, extending the gap to 115 points. At North Plate, the gap would end up staying the same, and with 13 races to go, Herb Thomas seemed to have control over the championship. And Dick Rathman, if he wanted to win the championship, he would have quite the uphill battle. At Davenport, Thomas would win while Rathman finished 4th and grow the gap to 140 points. At Hillsborough, Thomas would finish 2nd and Rathman would have an abysmal 19th place finish that was now a whopping 204 points behind. At Weaverville, Rathman would gouge more points by finishing 14th while Thomas finished 2nd and the gap was now 250 points. At Virginia Beach, Thomas would win the race while Rathman finished 4th and was now 275 points behind. At Hickory, Thomas would finish 2nd and Rathman 12th, and the gap was now 318 points. At the Southern 500, Thomas would have a solid 5th place finish, while Dick Rathman would have an abysmal day and knock himself out of the championship picture with a 42nd place finish. And with 7 races to go, all Herb Thomas had to do was finish 11th or better in the remaining 7 races, and he would be crowned as the champion. At Macon, Petty finished 2nd while Thomas finished 6th and was now 350 points back. All Thomas had to do now was finish 12th. At Langhorne, Thomas finished 2nd and Petty 6th. The gap was now 380 points, and now the threshold moved to 20th. At Bloomsburg, Thomas would win the race while Petty would finish 6th, and the gap was now 405 points. But in the last 4 races of the season, due to the field sizes not exceeding 31 cars, the max amount of points Thomas would lose was 380 points, 25 points less than what the gap from him to Petty was. And with 4 races to go, Herb Thomas would lock up the championship. So either way, Herb Thomas would claim the championship in 1953, but in this timeline, it would only be his first due to his 51 title going to Fonty Flock. Herb Thomas's 1953 season was so consistent that his 2 biggest competitors just couldn't keep up, and it resulted in Herb Thomas winning the championship 4 races before the end of the season. In 1954, we would have 11 full-time drivers, over double from 1953, defending champion Herb Thomas, Herschel McGriff, Dick Rathman, Laird Bruner, Dave Terrell, Buck Baker, Lee Petty, Joe Eubanks, Blackie Pitt, Jim Pascal, and Ralph LaGlory. In the opening 7 races, we would have 3 full-time winners. Defending champion Herb Thomas would win 3 of the first 4 races, winning the season opener at West Palm Beach, and then winning races 3 and 4 at Jacksonville and Atlanta. Dick Rathman would win race 6 at Oakland, and then the next week at North Wilkesboro, and Lee Petty would win race 2 at Daytona Beach. So after 7 races, the 1949 and 50 champion Lee Petty was at the top of the standings by a very thin margin over Buck Baker. At Hillsborough, Baker would finish 3rd while Petty would finish 6th, and this would hand Baker the point lead by 8 points. At Macon, Baker would finish 8th and Petty 9th, extending the gap to 17 points. At Langhorne, Baker would finish 6th and Petty 9th, growing the gap to 24 points. At Wilson, Baker would dominate and win while Petty would finish 4th, and the gap was now 49 points. At Martinsville, Petty would finish 2nd while Baker would come home 18th, and this would hand the point lead back to Petty by just 12 points. At Sharon, Lee Petty would win while Baker would finish second, and grew the gap to 22 points. At Raleigh, Petty would finish fourth while Baker would finish ninth. After 14 races, it seemed to be a showdown between the two-time champion of Lee Petty and Buck Baker. At Charlotte, Buck Baker would dominate and take the win while Petty finished second, and the gap was now 24 points. Fast forward 2 races to Columbia, and Lee Petty would finish 5th and Baker finished 8th, and grew the gap to 37 points. At the Linden Airport, Buck Baker would finish 3rd and Petty would finish 10th, and the gap was only 1 point with Petty in the lead and Baker in second. At Hickory, Petty would finish 2nd and Baker finished 3rd, slightly extending the gap to 6 points. At Rochester, Petty would win while Baker would finish 4th and grow the gap to 26 points. At Mechanicsburg, Baker would finish 6th and Petty would finish 7th, and with 16 races to go, we would have a tight championship battle. At Spartanburg, Petty would finish 3rd and Baker finished 4th, slightly increasing the gap to 27 points. At Weaverville, Petty would finish 4th while Baker finished a mediocre 14th and grew the gap to 66 points. Fast forward 2 races to the Grand Rapids, Lee Petty would win the race while Baker finished 2nd, grew the gap to 76 points. At Morristown, Buck Baker would have a bounce-back race and win, while Petty would finish 6th and shrink the gap to 46 points. Skipping 2 races ahead to Charlotte, Lee Petty would answer with a win while Baker would finish 4th. And now, with 9 races to go, the championship battle was heating up. And now it would be a question of would it be the 2-time champion of Lee Petty or would it be Buck Baker? At San Mateo, Buck Baker's championship bid would get off to a not-so-great start with a 17th place finish, while Petty would finish 5th and now the gap was 104 points. At Corbin, Petty would strengthen his chances with a win while Buck Baker would finish 3rd, and now the gap was 119 points. At the Southern 500, both drivers would have horrible races with Baker finishing 44th and Petty finishing 38th, and the gap grew to 126 points. At Macon, Buck Baker's chances at the crown would essentially end with a 21st place finish, while Petty went on to finish 3rd, and the gap was now over a race's worth of points at 191. At Charlotte, Petty would outrun Baker again with a 2nd place finish, and the gap grew to 196 points. At Langhorne, Petty would finish 2nd and Baker in 4th, and the gap once again grew to 206 points. At Lehigh, Buck Baker would stop the bleeding with a win, while Petty finishing 3rd, and the gap slightly shrunk to 201 points. Going into the penultimate race of the season, Petty could lock up the championship a race early. All he had to do was finish 22nd, but in the penultimate race at Martinsville, Petty would win the race to put the exclamation point on the season and lock up the championship a race early. In 1954, Lee Petty would take home the title either way, but in this timeline, he would claim his 3rd championship after taking the inaugural season in 1949 away from Red Byron and 1950 away from Bill Rexford. In 1954, Buck Baker would put up a hell of a fight, but when it came down to it, he would crack under the pressure while Petty would thrive and take home his 3rd crown in 6 years. In 1955, we would have 8 full-time drivers. 1954 runner-up Buck Baker, defending champion Lee Petty, Bob Wellborn, Tim Flock, Jimmy Llewellyn, Eddie Skinner, Jim Paschal, and Junior Johnson. In the opening 9 races, Lee Petty would win the season opener at High Point, then again 2 races later at Jacksonville, and then again at race 5 at Savannah. Tim Flock would win race 4 at Daytona Beach, and then again at race 9 in Montgomery. Jim Paschal would win the race at Hillsboro, and Buck Baker would win race 8 at North Wilkesboro. So after the opening 9 races, the top 2 drivers from 1954 were once again at the top. At Langhorne, Baker would finish 2nd and Petty would finish 7th, closing the gap to 76 points. At Charlotte, Buck Baker would win the race while Petty finished 18th, and the gap was now just 14 points. At Hickory, Petty finished 4th while Baker finished 11th, and the gap grew to 44 points. 3 races later at Martinsville, Petty would finish 2nd while Baker would finish 6th, and the gap grew to 64 points. At Richmond, Petty would finish 3rd and Baker would finish 17th, growing the gap to 117 points. At Raleigh, Baker would finish 3rd and Petty 4th, shrinking the gap to 112 points. At Winston-Salem, Petty won the race while Baker finished 12th, and after 18 races, Baker was trailing behind Petty by quite a bit. At New Oxford, Baker would finish 3rd while Petty finished 14th, and the gap shrunk to 121 points. At Rochester, Baker would finish 16th and Petty 20th, shrinking the gap to 109 points. At Fonda, Petty would finish 3rd and Baker 4th, growing the gap to 114 points. At Plattsburgh, Petty would win and Baker would finish 2nd, and the gap was now 124 points. At Charlotte, Baker would finish 2nd and Petty would finish 9th, shrinking the gap to 92 points. At Spartanburg, Petty would finish 3rd and Baker would come home 4th, growing the gap to 97 points. At Columbia, Baker finished 5th while Petty finished 13th, and the gap was now 66 points. At Weaverville, Baker finished 9th and Petty finished 18th, shrinking the gap to 37 points. At Morristown, Petty would solidly finish 2nd while Baker disappointingly finished 23rd, and now, with 18 races to go, defending champion Lee Petty had a sizable lead over Buck Baker. At Altamont, Petty finished 3rd while Baker had a horrible day, finishing in 25th, growing the gap to 185 points. At Syracuse, Petty finished 3rd while Baker finished 9th, and he would slip back to 3rd, 212 points back. Meanwhile, Tim Flock, who won the race, moved into 2nd, and was now 207 points behind. At San Mateo, Flock would win again while Petty finished 6th, and Flock was now 177 points behind, and Baker finished 5th, and was now 212 points back. At Charlotte, Flock finished 5th while Petty finished 10th and shrunk the gap to 156 points. Baker finished 3rd and shrunk the gap to 181 points. At Winston-Salem, Lee Petty would win the race while Flock would finish 7th and grew the gap to 190 points, and Baker would finish 3rd and was now 201 points behind. At Lehigh, Petty finished 19th while Flock would finish 3rd and shrink the gap to 126 points. Buck Baker would finish 5th and was now 152 points behind. At Raleigh, Flock would finish 2nd while Petty had a horrible race, finishing 22nd, and the gap between him and Flock was now 48 points. Buck Baker would finish 5th and he was now 99 points back. At the Southern 500, Lee Petty would once again have an abysmal race and finish 21st, while Flock would finish 3rd, and Flock would take the point lead by 22 points over Petty, and Baker finished 6th. It was now 71 points behind in 3rd. At Montgomery, Flock would win the race, and now with 9 races left, Tim Flock seemed to be in control over the 3-time and defending champion Lee Petty and Buck Baker. At Langhorne, Flock would win while Petty would finish a horrible 28th, and he would slip back to 3rd, 150 points back. Baker would have a decent 6th place finish and would move into 2nd, and was now 136 points behind. At Raleigh, Flock would finish 3rd while Baker finished 7th, growing the gap to 160 points. And Petty would finish 9th and is now 182 points back. At Greenville, Flock would win again while Baker finished 5th, and was now 190 points back. And Lee Petty would drop out of contention with a 10th place finish. At Lehigh, Flock would finish 4th while Baker finished 6th, and the gap would extend to 205 points. Fast forward 2 races to Martinsville, where Baker would outrun Flock with a 10th place finish, and Flock would finish 24th, shrinking the gap to 167 points. Fast forward to the penultimate race of the season in North Wilkesboro, and due to the field size at the finale, and Hillsboro only being 25 cars, the max amount of points Flock could lose at the finale was 97 points. So at North Wilkesboro, all Flock had to do was finish 19th, and despite Baker dominating the race, Flock would finish 5th and he would lock up the championship a week early. And to add to his 2nd championship season, he would cap it off with a win in the finale at Hillsboro. So either way, in 1955, Tim Flock would claim his 2nd championship. This season, early on, would seem to be a repeat of 1954, with Lee Petty and Buck Baker fighting for the title once again. But with Tim Flock making up almost 800 points from the start of the season, and just making the most of his other competitors' misfortunes, he would climb up the standings and win his 2nd title. In 1956, we would have 7 full-time drivers: Speedy Thompson, Billy Myers, 3-time champion Lee Petty, 1953 champion Herb Thomas, Jim Pascal, Buck Baker, and Ralph Moody. In the opening 11 races, we would have 3 full-time winners: Herb Thomas would win race 4 at West Palm Beach and race 8 at Wilson. Buck Baker would win race 5 at Phoenix, race 9 at Atlanta, and race 11 at Langhorne. And Billy Myers would win race 7 at the second running at West Palm Beach. So after the first 11 races, the driver who had finished runner-up the last 2 seasons, Buck Baker, would now have the lead over 1953 champion Herb Thomas. Over the course of the next 11 races, Buck Baker would extend his lead with 5 wins in 11 races at Richmond, Greenville, Hillsborough, Martinsville, and New Oxford, while Herb Thomas would only win 2 races at Portland and Eureka. In this span of races, Buck Baker would extend his lead, and the question would be, would this be the year after 2 straight runner-up championship finishes? At Syracuse, Baker would win while Thomas did not participate and was now 284 points behind. But at Merced, Baker wouldn't participate while Thomas would win, and the gap was now back down to 104 points. At Lehigh, Thomas finished 7th while Baker finished 9th, but Thomas lost points due to Baker leading the most laps, and the gap was now 106 points. At Charlotte, Baker would finish 5th while Thomas finished 6th, growing the gap to 111 points. At Rochester, Thomas finished 3rd while Baker finished 4th, shrinking the gap back to 106 points. At Portland, Buck Baker wouldn't participate and Herb Thomas would finish 11th, taking the lead by 24 points. At Weaverville, Thomas finished a solid 5th, and while Baker finished a poor 21st, and the gap was now 79 points, with Thomas in the lead. At Raleigh, Thomas finished 4th while Baker finished a mediocre 11th, growing the gap to 104 points. At Spartanburg, Baker finished 13th while Thomas finished 17th, closing the gap to 92 points. At Soldier Field in Chicago, Baker finished 6th while Thomas finished 18th, and the gap between the 53 champion Herb Thomas and the previous 2 seasons runner-up were dueling it out for the title. At race 34 in Shelby, Baker would finish 5th while Thomas finished 8th and shrunk the gap to 33 points. At Montgomery, Baker finished 2nd and Thomas finished 6th, once again closing the gap to just 13 points. In Oklahoma City, Thomas finished 4th while Baker finished 9th and grew the gap to 35 points. At Road America, Thomas finished 6th while Baker finished 8th and grew the gap to 38 points. At Old Bridge, Thomas once again finished 6th, while Baker again finished 8th and grew the gap to 46 points. At San Mateo, Baker finished 35th, while Thomas finished 36th, and barely shrunk the gap to 44 points. At Norfolk, Baker finished 4th and Thomas 10th, shrinking the gap to 18 points. At Spartanburg, Thomas finished 4th, while Baker finished 7th, and grew the gap to 32 points. At Myrtle Beach, Baker finished 4th, while Thomas finished 13th. And Baker would take the lead by just 4 points. At Portland, Thomas finished 7th and Baker did not participate, and Thomas took the lead back by 142 points. At the Southern 500 in Darlington, both drivers had horrible days, with Baker finishing 26th and Thomas finishing 49th, and with 11 races to go, we had a really close championship battle. At Montgomery, Baker would win while Thomas finished 6th, and the gap was now 61 points. At Charlotte, Thomas finished 4th while Baker finished a horrible 23rd, and the gap was now 127 points. At Langhorne, Herb Thomas finished 5th while Baker would have an abysmal race, finishing 38th, and the gap was now a whopping 220 points. 2 races later at Columbia, Baker would win the race while Thomas would finish 8th, and shrunk the gap to 182 points. Hillsborough, Baker finished 2nd while Thomas finished 4th and shrunk the gap to 162 points. At Newport, Baker finished 2nd while Thomas finished 5th and the gap shrunk again to 137 points. At Charlotte, Baker would dominate and win while Thomas finished 7th and the gap was now 98 points. At Shelby, Thomas would have a horrible run, finishing 17th while Baker would go on and win, and the gap was now down to just 30 points with 3 races to go. At Martinsville, Baker would finish 7th while Thomas did not participate, and Baker took the lead back by 116 points. At the penultimate race of the season in Hickory, Herb Thomas did not participate again, and this essentially made Buck Baker the championship, and to cap off Baker's championship winning season, he would cap it off with a win at Wilson Speedway. So either way, in 1956, Buck Baker would win the championship over Herb Thomas. This would be one of the better battles in the early days of NASCAR. Baker and Thomas just seemed to be dueling it out, until Herb Thomas pulled out a huge 220-point lead, until Buck Baker put together 4 straight top 2 finishes and made up 190 points, until Thomas missed the last 3 races, and this would seal the championship for Buck Baker. In 1957, we had 12 full-time drivers: Jim Paschal, defending champion Buck Baker, Fireball Roberts, 3-time champion Lee Petty, Speedy Thompson, L.D. Austin, Tiny Lund, Johnny Allen, Marvin Panch, Jack Smith, Brownie King, and Billy Myers. In the opening 11 races, Marvin Panch would win the opening 2 races at Lancaster and Concord. Fireball Roberts would win race 3 at Titusville and then would go 3 in a row at North Wilkesboro, Langhorne, and Charlotte. Jack Smith would win the race at Concord, and defending series champion Buck Baker would win at Hillsboro and Weaverville. So after the first 11 races, Marvin Panch would have the lead over Fireball Roberts. Over the course of the next 11 races, Marvin Panch would actually hold on to his point lead, but the lead would be shrunk despite Panch winning race 12 at Spartanburg. And the first 22 races done, this seemed to be a showdown between Fireball Roberts and Marvin Panch. At Newport, Fireball Roberts won while Panch finished second and shrunk the gap to 39 points. At Columbia, Panch finished third while Roberts finished 16th, and the gap would grow to 89 points. At Spartanburg, Roberts finished 9th while Panch finished a disappointing 19th, and the gap was now 57 points. And with both drivers having mediocre races, this would bring defending champion Buck Baker into the fold, and he was now 154 points back. At Jacksonville, Marvin Panch did not participate and would fall back to third, 70 points behind new leader Fireball Roberts, who finished 12th. And Buck Baker finished third and was now 44 points behind Roberts. At Raleigh, Roberts finished 13th while Baker finished 7th, and the gap was now 22 points. Panch finished 8th and was now 52 points behind Roberts. At Charlotte, Marvin Panch would take the win and was now 22 points behind Roberts in third. Baker finished second while Roberts finished 5th. Baker was now 7 points behind. At Lehigh, Panch would win again and move into second. It was now 7 points behind Roberts, who finished third. Baker finished fourth and was now third, 12 points behind. At Hickory, Fireball Roberts would have a solid race, finishing 5th, and now, with 20 races to go, we seem to have a 3-way title fight. At Norfolk, the turning point of the season would take place, with Buck Baker winning while Roberts finished 21st and was now second, 61 points back. Panch wouldn't fare much better with a 16th place finish. It was now 81 points back in third. At Lancaster, Baker finished 4th while Roberts finished 7th. It was now 75 points behind in second. Panch finished 3rd and was now 76 points behind in third. At Watkins Glen, Baker would dominate and win while Roberts finished 2nd, and Roberts was now 90 points behind. Panch finished 14th and was now 140 points back in third. At New Oxford, Marvin Panch had a bounce-back week, winning the race while Baker finished 26th and Roberts finished 31st. With this result, Panch moved into second, 44 points behind, and Roberts slipped back to third, 100 points back. At Old Bridge, Panch finished 4th while Baker finished 7th, and Panch was now back by just 30 points. Roberts finished 6th and was now 96 points behind. At Myrtle Beach, Baker finished 4th while Panch's momentum would come to an end with a 13th place finish, and he was now 66 points behind in second. Roberts finished 3rd and was now 81 points back. At the Southern 500, Panch finished 3rd and Baker finished 5th, and shrunk the gap to 56 points. Fireball Roberts had an abysmal race, finishing 33rd, and was now 159 points back. At Syracuse, Fireball Roberts was only contender to participate, and he walked away with a 5th place finish, and he moved up to second, just 4 points behind Baker. At Weaverville, Baker scored a solid 2nd place finish, and with 11 races left in the season, Baker, Roberts, and Panch were all only separated by just 85 points. At Langhorne, Baker finished 5th while Roberts finished 17th. It was now 78 points behind. Marvin Panch finished an abysmal 34th. It was now 170 points behind. At Columbia, Baker would win the race while Roberts finished 15th. It was now 140 points back. Marvin was now 200 points behind with a 6th place finish. It was now out of contention. At Shelby, Baker won again while Roberts finished 14th. It was now 199 points behind Baker. At Charlotte, Roberts finished second while Baker finished fourth and slightly shrunk the gap to 189 points. At Martinsville, Roberts finished 12th while Baker finished 23rd and shrunk the gap to 156 points. At Newberry, Roberts won the race while Baker finished second and only shrunk the gap to 146 points. At Concord, Roberts made a back-to-back win while Baker finished 9th and was now 99 points back. At the penultimate race of the season at North Wilkesboro, Baker finished 6th while Roberts finished a horrible 21st and was now 139 points back. And with the finale only having 31 cars, Baker would clinch his second championship a week early over Fireball Roberts, and to cap off his championship-winning season, he would win the finale at Greensboro. So either way, in 1957, Buck Baker would go 2 in a row and only be the second driver to do so. Baker would start on the back foot early, missing 2 more races than everyone else, and just clawing his way to the lead over Marvin Panch and Fireball Roberts. And despite having a close 3-way battle, Buck Baker would be the one to rise to the occasion and take home his second consecutive championship. In 1958, we only had 4 full-time drivers: 2-time defending champion Buck Baker, Speedy Thompson, 3-time champion Lee Petty, and Jack Smith. In the opening 10 races, we had 5 races won by contenders. Lee Petty would win race 3 at Concord and race 5 at Wilson. 2-time defending champion Buck Baker won race 6 at Hillsboro, and Speedy Thompson would win race 8 and 9 at Columbia and Spartanburg. So after the first 10 races, 3-time champion Lee Petty was at the top of the board, with a 57-point gap over Jack Smith. Over the course of the next 10 races, Lee Petty, despite not winning a race, would extend his gap by 90 points, just by being consistent, and this seemed like the year where Lee Petty could potentially clinch that 4th championship. At Riverside, Smith finished 3rd while Petty finished 4th, and the gap would shrink to 142 points. At Columbia, Smith finished the race in 6th while Petty finished 9th, and the gap shrunk to 120 points. At Bradford, Petty finished 2nd while Smith finished 4th and grew the gap to 130 points. At Reading, Petty finished 4th while Smith finished 21st and grew the gap to 190 points. At New Oxford, Petty won the race while Smith finished 20th, and the gap was now 267 points. At Hickory, Petty won again while Smith finished 4th and grew the gap to 287 points. At Weaverville, Petty finished 6th and Smith finished 25th, growing the gap to 349 points. At Raleigh, Petty finished 6th while Jack Smith finished 32nd, and the gap was now a whopping 430 points. At Asheville, Petty finished 4th and Smith in 5th, growing the gap to 435 points. At Boosty, Petty finished 8th while no other contender would participate, and now Petty was essentially a lock for the championship with an almost 600-point gap. At Toronto, Petty would win while Smith wouldn't participate, and the gap was now 767 points. At Buffalo, Petty finished 6th while Smith again did not participate, and the gap was now at 917 points. At Rochester, Petty finished 4th and Smith finished 17th, making the gap 960 points. At Wall, Petty finished 4th and Smith 5th, making the gap 965 points. At Bridgehampton, Petty finished 6th and Smith won the race, and the gap was now 930 points. At Columbia, Petty finished 7th and Smith didn't participate, and the gap was now 1,076 points. At Nashville, Petty finished 5th and Smith finished 8th, making the gap 1,089 points. At Weaverville, Petty finished 3rd and Smith finished 31st, and the gap was now 1,178 points. At Winston-Salem, Lee Petty won the race and Jack Smith did not participate, and the gap was 1,363 points. And this would be enough for Petty to lock up the championship 12 races early. In 1958, Lee Petty dominated the season, and it was all really down to him participating in 6 more races than every other driver. This season would not even be close, and this would result in Lee Petty winning championship number 4 in our timeline. In 1959, we had 7 full-time drivers: Bob Wellborn, Cotton Owens, L.D. Austin, Buck Baker, defending champion Lee Petty, Erman Beam, and Speedy Thompson. In the opening 7 races, we had 2 drivers win the races. Bob Wellborn would win the opening 2 races at Fayetteville and Daytona, and Lee Petty would win the inaugural Daytona 500. So after the first 7 races, Lee Petty seemed to pick up right where he left off and already had a sizable lead over Bob Wellborn. Over the next 7 races, Lee Petty would separate himself from the rest while Wellborn would be phased out of contention, and Petty would win 2 of the races at Columbia and Martinsville, and now had a huge lead over Cotton Owens in second. At Charlotte, Lee Petty won the race while Owens finished third, and the gap was now 349 points. At Nashville, Petty finished 6th while Owens finished 8th and grew the gap to 362 points. At Spartanburg, Petty finished 12th and Owens finished 18th, growing the gap to 371 points. At Greenville, Petty finished 3rd and Owens finished 16th, growing the gap to 421 points. At Atlanta, Petty won again while Owens finished 25th, and the gap was now 513 points. At Columbia, Petty won again, and at the halfway point of the season, Lee Petty had immense control over the competition. At Wilson, Petty finished 4th and Owens finished 11th, growing the gap to 605 points. At Richmond, Owens finished 5th and Petty finished 18th, closing the gap to 559 points. At Winston-Salem, Petty finished 10th and Owens finished 11th, growing the gap to 563 points. At Weaverville, Petty finished 2nd and Owens finished 6th, growing the gap to 583 points. At Daytona, Owens finished 8th while Petty finished 33rd, and the gap was now 513 points. At Pittsburgh, Petty finished 3rd while Owens finished 5th, growing the gap to 523 points. At Charlotte, Owens finished 4th and Petty finished 10th, and now the gap with just 16 races left in the season, Petty just needed to finish 5th or better in every race in order to clinch the title. At Myrtle Beach, Petty finished 6th while Owens finished 19th, and the gap was now 541 points. At Charlotte, Petty finished 18th while Owens finished 29th, and the gap grew to 575 points. At Nashville, Petty finished 4th while Owens didn't participate, growing the gap to 740 points. At Weaverville, Petty finished 2nd while Owens finished 7th, and the gap was now 764 points. At Winston-Salem, Petty finished 3rd while Owens didn't participate, and the gap was now 929 points. At Greenville, Petty finished 18th while Owens finished 2nd and shrunk the gap to 873 points. At Columbia, Petty won the race while Owens did not participate, and the gap was now 1,053 points, and this would be enough for Petty to clinch the championship 9 races early. So in 1958 and 1959, Lee Petty would claim his 4th and 5th championships, cementing himself as the Pioneer Era's GOAT. In the 1960 season, we would have 6 full-time drivers: Junior Johnson, Richard Petty, Lee Petty, Rex White, Ned Jarrett, and Buck Baker. In the opening 7 races, Ned Jarrett won race 2 at Columbia, Junior Johnson would win the second running of the Daytona 500, and Richard Petty would win the race at Charlotte. So after the first 7 races, defending champion Lee Petty would lead the standings with his son Richard Petty in second, just 25 points behind. Over the next 7 races, Richard Petty would simply outrun his father and would actually take the lead at Martinsville with a win. And after 14 races, it was a battle between the father-son duo of Richard and Lee Petty. At the next race in Weaverville, Lee Petty would win the race and take the point lead away from Richard Petty, who finished 9th, and was now 28 points behind Lee. Rex White finished 7th and was now 148 points behind Lee Petty. At Darlington, Richard Petty finished 2nd and Lee Petty finished 4th, closing the gap to 23 points, and White finished 3rd, and the gap flatlined to 148 points. At Spartanburg, Lee finished 2nd while Richard finished 11th, and the gap was now 63 points. Rex White finished 12th and was now 191 points behind. At Hillsboro, Lee Petty won the race while Richard finished 6th and was now 98 points back, and White finished 11th and was now 246 points behind. At Richmond, Lee won again while Richard finished 6th and was now 128 points behind. White finished 6th and was now 251 points back. At Hanford, neither of the Pettys would participate, but Rex White would finish 8th and move into 2nd, 109 points behind Lee Petty. At the World 600 at Charlotte, we would have the turning point of the season. Rex White would finish in 6th, while the Pettys would finish 55th and 56th. And now, after 21 races, Rex White had the points lead by 13 points over Lee Petty. At Winston-Salem, White finished 3rd while Lee Petty finished 2nd and shrunk the gap to 8 points. Richard finished 4th and was now 145 points back. At Daytona, Lee Petty finished 4th and took the lead back by 2 points over White, who finished 6th. And Richard Petty finished 11th and was now 167 points back in 3rd. At Pittsburgh, Lee Petty won the race while White finished 3rd. It was now 22 points behind. Richard finished 2nd and is now 182 points back. At Montgomery, White would fire back with a win, while Lee finished 3rd and was now only 2 points ahead of White. Richard finished 2nd and is now 177 points ahead of Father Lee. At Myrtle Beach, Lee finished 2nd and White 3rd, growing the gap to 7 points. Richard finished 5th and was now 192 points back. At Atlanta, Lee finished 8th while White finished 23rd and was now 55 points back. Richard finished 20th and was now 231 points back and now out of contention. At Birmingham, Petty finished 3rd while White finished 9th. And we now had a 2-horse battle between the 5-time champ of Lee Petty and Rex White. At Nashville, White finished 2nd and Petty finished 4th, shrinking the gap to 72 points. At Weaverville, White won the race while Petty finished 8th and shrunk the gap to 34 points. At Spartanburg, Petty finished 2nd and White finished 5th, growing the gap to 49 points. At Columbia, White would win the race and Petty finished 7th, shrinking the gap to 15 points. At South Boston, White finished 3rd and Petty finished 7th, and took the lead away from Petty by 4 points. At Winston-Salem, Petty finished 2nd while White finished 4th, and Petty took the lead back by just 6 points. At the Southern 500, Rex White finished 2nd, while Lee Petty finished in abysmal 30th, and with 9 races to go, Rex White was now in full control of the championship. At Hickory, White finished 3rd and Petty finished 8th, extending the gap to 107 points. Fast forward 2 races to Sumter, where Lee Petty finished 5th and White finished 6th, closing the gap to 102 points. At Hillsborough, White finished 3rd and Petty finished 11th, growing the gap to 137 points. At Martinsville, Rex White had a statement win while Lee Petty finished 23rd, and the gap was now a whopping 228 points. At North Wilkesboro, White won again and Petty finished 20th, and the gap grew to a huge 310 points. At Charlotte, White finished a solid 6th, while Petty finished a horrible 36th, making the gap 404 points. And this would be enough for Rex White to lock up the championship 2 races early. So to open up the 60s, Rex White would take his first championship either way over the giants of Petty Enterprises. Despite having some competition early in the season, Rex White would pull through and outrun Lee Petty and capitalize on Petty's mistakes, and because of this, Rex White would walk away the champion of 1960. In the 1961 season, we had 9 full-time drivers: Richard Petty, defending champion Rex White, Ned Jarrett, Junior Johnson, Emmanuel Zervakis, Jimmy Perdue, Curtis Crider, Bug Baker, and Herman Beam. In the opening 10 races, we had only 2 full-time winners. Defending champion Rex White won the race at Weaverville, and Emmanuel Zervakis won the race at Greenville. So after the first 10 races, Rex White seemed to pick up right where he left off and would have a huge 315-point lead over Ned Jarrett. Over the next 10 races, Rex White would be super consistent, having 8 top 10s and 6 top 5s, including 2 wins at North Wilkesboro and Winston-Salem. So after 20 races into the season, Rex White was already the championship frontrunner, with a massive 440-point lead over Ned Jarrett. Fast forward 3 races to race 24 at the World 600 in Charlotte. Rex and Ned would score the same amount of points, flatlining the gap to 440 points. At Spartanburg, Jarrett finished 5th and White finished 10th, shrinking the gap to 419 points. At Birmingham, Jarrett won the race while White finished 4th and shrunk the gap to 399 points. At Greenville, Jarrett finished 2nd and White finished 8th, shrinking the gap to 361 points. At Winston-Salem, Rex White would fire back with a win while Jarrett finished 6th, increasing the deficit to 391 points. At Norwood, White finished 2nd and Jarrett finished 3rd, growing the gap to 396 points. At Hartsville, White finished 3rd and Jarrett finished 6th, and after 30 races, Jarrett has failed to make any sort of huge gain on Rex White. So at this point in the season, this would be Rex White's championship to lose. At Roanoke, White finished 2nd and Jarrett finished 11th, growing the gap to 451 points. At Daytona, Jarrett finished 12th and White finished 23rd, reducing the gap to 418 points. At Atlanta, Jarrett finished 14th while White finished 10th and grew the gap to 431 points. At Columbia, Jarrett finished 3rd and White finished 14th, shrinking the gap to 387 points. At Myrtle Beach, Jarrett finished 3rd and White finished 10th, shrinking the gap to 351 points. At Bristol, Jarrett finished a solid 3rd while White had a horrid day, finishing in 25th, and the gap significantly shrunk to 279 points. At Nashville, Ned Jarrett once again took a large chunk out of White's lead with a 3rd place finish, while White finished 23rd, and the gap was now 203 points. At Winston-Salem, White would stop the bleeding with a win and Jarrett finished 3rd, increasing the gap to 218 points. At Weaverville, White finished 2nd and Jarrett finished 3rd, growing the gap to 223 points. At Richmond, Jarrett finished 2nd, White finished 4th, and with 12 races to go, Jarrett was finally able to make significant ground, and now the question was, could he continue this run of form and potentially take the title away from Rex White? At South Boston, Jarrett finished 3rd and White finished 5th, closing the gap to 203 points. At the Southern 500, Jarrett finished 6th and White finished 10th, closing the gap to 187 points. At Hickory, White would fire back with a win while Jarrett finished 8th, and the gap grew to 215 points. At Richmond, White finished 3rd and Jarrett finished 4th, slightly increasing the gap to 220 points. Fast forward 2 races to Atlanta, where Jarrett finished 7th and White finished 18th, shrinking the gap to 183 points. At Martinsville, White had a solid day, finishing in 2nd, while Jarrett finished in 13th, growing the gap to 229 points. At North Wilkesboro, Rex White would make a statement and win, while Ned Jarrett finished 5th, and the gap was now 259 points. At Charlotte, Rex White finished 5th, while Jarrett finished in 18th, and grew the gap to 305 points. And with this race, this cushion would be good enough to lock up the championship 3 races early, and this would give Rex White his 2nd consecutive championship. In 1961, Rex White would claim his 2nd championship, and for the first time since the 1951 video, we had a different champion. In real life, Ned Jarrett would claim his 1st title, but in 1961, Rex White would just simply outduel him and dominate the season. And with this, Rex White was now a 2-time champion in the NASCAR Cup Series. In 1962, we had 8 full-time drivers: Richard Petty, 2-time defending champion Rex White, Ned Jarrett, Jack Smith, Curtis Kreider, Joe Weatherly, Jim Pascal, and Herman Beam. In the opening 11 races, we had 4 full-time winners. Jack Smith won races at Concord and Savannah. Defending champion Rex White would win 3 races at Weaverville, Hillsboro, and Richmond. Joe Weatherly would win 3 races at Daytona, Concord, and Weaverville. And Ned Jarrett would win race 11 at Columbia. So after 12 races into the season, Joe Weatherly had the points lead over Jack Smith by 94 points. Over the course of the next 11 races, Joe Weatherly and Jack Smith would trade blows and win a few races in the process. But even through all this, the championship battle overall would tighten up, and Jack Smith was now just 15 points behind Joe Weatherly. At the World 600 in Charlotte, Weatherly finished the race in 2nd and Smith finished in 24th, and the gap was now 94 points. At Atlanta, Smith finished in 13th and Weatherly finished 18th, shrinking the gap to 84 points. At Winston-Salem, Weatherly finished in 5th and Smith finished in 10th, growing the gap to 105 points. At Augusta, Joe Weatherly would win and Smith finished 12th, growing the gap to 158 points. At Richmond, Weatherly finished 7th and Smith finished 8th, growing the gap to 162 points. At South Boston, Smith finished 2nd and Weatherly finished 7th, and shrunk the gap to 128 points. At Daytona, Smith finished 4th and Weatherly finished 23rd, shrinking the gap to 62 points. At Columbia, Weatherly finished 2nd and Smith 3rd, growing the gap to 67 points. At Asheville, Smith won the race and Weatherly finished second, shrinking the gap to 52 points. At Greenville, Smith finished a solid second, while Weatherly had a horrible day, finishing in 19th. After 32 races, Smith had now taken the point lead away from Weatherly, and we now had a real championship fight. At Augusta, Joe Weatherly won the race while Smith finished 14th, and Weatherly took the lead back and now had a 37-point lead over Smith. At Savannah, Weatherly won again while Smith finished 18th, and the gap was now 108 points. At Myrtle Beach, Weatherly finished second and Smith finished third, extending the gap to 113 points. At Bristol, Weatherly finished sixth while Smith finished 21st, and the gap was now 163 points. At Ringgold, Weatherly won while Smith finished 10th, growing the gap to 209 points. At Nashville, Weatherly finished 4th and Smith finished 18th, growing the gap to 260 points. At Huntsville, Smith finished 7th and Weatherly finished 8th, slightly shrinking the gap to 256 points. At Weaverville, Weatherly finished 2nd while Smith finished in 5th, growing the gap to 266 points. At Roanoke, Weatherly and Smith finished 2nd and 5th again, growing the gap to 276 points. At Winston-Salem, Smith finished 2nd and Weatherly finished 3rd. And now, with 11 races to go, it would take a miracle for Jack Smith to catch Joe Weatherly. At Spartanburg, Weatherly finished 2nd while Smith finished in 3rd, and the gap was now 276 points. At Valdosta, Weatherly finished 2nd while Smith finished 11th, and Smith would slip back to 3rd, 311 points behind. With this result, Richard Petty would move into 2nd. He is now 297 points behind Weatherly. At Darlington, Petty finished 5th while Weatherly finished 10th, closing the gap to 262 points. At Hickory, Weatherly finished 5th and Petty finished 10th, and the gap was now 287 points. At Richmond, Weatherly won the race while Petty finished 4th, and the gap grew to 307 points. At Moyock, Weatherly finished 2nd and Petty finished 11th, growing the gap to 347 points. At Augusta, Petty finished 2nd while Weatherly finished 3rd, closing the gap to 342 points. At Martinsville, Petty finished 2nd and Weatherly finished 5th, closing the gap to 332 points. At North Wilkesboro, Petty would win while Weatherly finished 3rd, and with this finish, it would be good enough for Joe Weatherly to lock up the championship 2 races early over Richard Petty. 1962, Joe Weatherly would hold the point lead for all but one race, and once he took it back, he would just run away with it, and despite a late charge from Richard Petty, Joe Weatherly would keep his cool and walk away with his first Cup Series championship. In 1963, we only had 4 full-time drivers: Richard Petty, defending champion Joe Weatherly, Jimmy Pardue, and Ned Jarrett. In the first 11 races, only one full-time driver won a race, and that would be Richard Petty. Petty went on to win races at Tampa, Spartanburg, and Weaverville. After the opening 11 races, Richard Petty, the 1962 runner-up, was now in the points lead over the defending champion, Joe Weatherly. Over the course of the next 11 races, Richard Petty would dominate and win 4 races, including 3 in a row at Martinsville, North Wilkesboro, and Columbia. And with Petty running extremely well, he now had a sizable 187-point lead over Ned Jarrett. At Darlington, Petty finished 3rd and Jarrett finished 20th, growing the gap to 259 points. At Manassas, Petty won the race and Jarrett finished 2nd, growing the gap to 269 points. At Richmond, the roles would be reversed and Jarrett would win and Petty would be the one finishing in 2nd, closing the gap to 259 points. At Charlotte, Jarrett finished 30th and Petty finished 36th, closing the gap to 247 points. At Birmingham, Petty won the race while Jarrett finished 4th, extending the gap to 272 points. At Atlanta, Jarrett finished 10th and Petty finished 8th, slightly closing the gap to 265 points. At Daytona, Jarrett finished 5th and Petty finished 8th, closing the gap to 252 points. At Myrtle Beach, Jarrett won the race and Petty finished 15th, shrinking the gap to 190 points. At Savannah, Jarrett won the race again and Petty finished 15th, closing the gap to 128 points. At Moyock, Jarrett finished 2nd and Petty finished 11th, closing the gap to 78 points. At Winston-Salem, Jarrett finished 2nd and Petty finished 8th, and now a little after the halfway mark of the season, we had a close-fought battle between Ned Jarrett and Richard Petty. At Asheville, Ned Jarrett won and Petty finished second, closing the gap to 40 points. At Old Bridge, Jarrett finished fourth and Petty finished 16th, and this gave Ned Jarrett the point lead by 5 points. At Bridgehampton, Richard Petty took the lead back by 38 points with a win, while Jarrett finished 8th. At Bristol, Petty finished second and Jarrett finished 25th, growing the gap to 125 points. Fast forward 2 races to Nashville, Richard Petty finished 4th while Ned Jarrett finished 7th, and the gap was now 149 points. At Columbia, Petty would win while Jarrett finished 4th, and the gap was now 174 points. At Weaverville, Petty finished 2nd while Jarrett finished 9th, growing the gap to 206 points. At Spartanburg, Jarrett won the race while Petty finished 2nd and slightly shrunk the gap to 196 points. At Winston-Salem, Petty finished 2nd and Jarrett finished 5th, growing the gap to 211 points. At Huntington, Jarrett finished 4th and Petty finished 10th, and now with 11 races to go, we had 2 drivers both going for their first championship. At the Southern 500 at Darlington, Petty finished 12th and Ned Jarrett finished 21st, growing the gap to 217 points. At Hickory, Jarrett finished 14th and Petty finished 15th, closing the gap to 209 points. At Richmond, Jarrett would win the race while Petty finished 6th, and the gap was now 179 points. At Martinsville, Petty finished 5th and Jarrett finished 19th, growing the gap to 228 points. At Moyock, Jarrett won while Petty finished 4th, closing the gap to 203 points. At North Wilkesboro, Jarrett finished 5th while Petty finished 26th, closing the gap to 134 points. At Randleman, Petty won while Jarrett finished 9th, extending the gap to 176 points. At Charlotte, Petty finished 6th while Jarrett finished 32nd, growing the gap to 252 points. At South Boston, Richard Petty won the race while Jarrett would not participate, and this would be enough for Richard Petty to lock up the championship 2 races early over Ned Jarrett. So in 1963, Richard Petty would claim his first championship. Ned Jarrett would put up a heck of a fight, but Petty just simply outran him. And also, the real-life champion Joe Weatherly was not even a part of the championship conversation, and instead of Weatherly claiming his 2nd consecutive championship, Richard Petty would claim his first. So in 1964, we had 5 full-time drivers: Ned Jarrett, defending champion Richard Petty, Jimmy Pardue, David Pearson, and Curtis Kreider. In the opening 12 races, Ned Jarrett would win the season opener at Concord, Richard Petty would win 2 races at Savannah and the Daytona 500, and David Pearson would win 2 races at Richmond and Greenville. So after the first 12 races, defending champion Richard Petty would pick up right where he left off by leading the standings by a thin margin of 65 points over Ned Jarrett. Over the course of the next 12 races, Ned Jarrett and Richard Petty would combine for 6 wins of the 12 races, and Ned Jarrett would marginally be better and overall just more consistent than Petty. And because of this, Ned Jarrett would take the point lead and now had a 147 point gap over the defending champion, Richard Petty. At Charlotte, Richard Petty finished 2nd while Jarrett finished a terrible 33rd, and the gap would significantly shrink to 49 points. At Greenville, Petty finished 2nd and Jarrett finished 14th, and there was now a tie for the points lead between the 2 drivers. At Asheville, Jarrett would fire back with a win while Petty finished 2nd, and Jarrett now had the lead by 15 points. At Atlanta, Jarrett would win again while Petty finished 2nd, and the gap grew to 25 points. At Concord, Petty would win the race, and Jarrett finished 3rd, closing the gap to 10 points. At Nashville, Petty won again, but Jarrett finished a terrible 17th, and Petty would take the lead by 63 points. At Ringgold, Petty finished 2nd and Jarrett finished 4th, growing the gap to 78 points. At Birmingham, Jarrett bounced back with a win while Petty finished 2nd, and the gap shrunk back to 63 points. At Valdosta, Petty finished 13th while Jarrett finished 19th, and the gap grew to 76 points. At Spartanburg, Petty won the race while Jarrett finished 5th, and the gap was now 91 points. At Daytona, Petty finished 16th while Jarrett finished 23rd, and the gap grew to 122 points. At Manassas, Ned Jarrett would stop the bleeding with a win while Petty finished 8th, and now after 36 races, we had one of the tightest championship battles we have ever seen between 2 legends of the sport. Fast forward 2 races to race 38 at Bridgehampton. Jarrett finished 6th while Petty finished 13th, shrinking the gap to 48 points. At Islip, Jarrett finished 2nd and Petty finished 3rd, closing the gap to 38 points. At Watkins Glen, Jarrett finished 8th while Petty finished 21st, and Ned Jarrett would take the point lead by 9 points over Petty. At New Oxford, Petty finished 2nd and Jarrett finished 15th, and Petty would take the lead back by 43 points. At Bristol, Petty finished 2nd while Jarrett finished 25th, and the gap grew to 135 points. At Nashville, Petty won the race while Jarrett finished 5th, growing the gap to 165 points. At Myrtle Beach, Petty finished 2nd and Jarrett finished 4th, slightly increasing the gap to 170 points. At Weaverville, Jarrett would stop the bleeding with a win while Petty finished a terrible 25th, and the gap was now 73 points, and the title fight was now back on. At Moyock, Jarrett won the race while Petty finished 3rd, closing the gap to 58 points. At Huntington, Petty would fire back with a win while Jarrett finished 3rd, and the gap reset back to 73 points. At Columbia, Jarrett finished 4th while Petty finished 17th, and now with 14 races to go in the season, we had the closest battle in NASCAR history up to this point. And now in the home stretch, the question would it be Jarrett or would it be Petty? At Winston-Salem, Petty finished 2nd and Jarrett finished 3rd, slightly growing the gap to 40 points. At Roanoke, Jarrett finished 2nd and Petty finished 15th, and this gave Jarrett the point lead by just 12 points. At the Southern 500 in Darlington, Petty finished 3rd with the most laps led, and Jarrett finished 4th, and Petty took the lead back by only 3 points. At Hickory, Richard Petty finished 5th, and Jarrett shockingly did not participate in this race, and the gap was now 158 points. At Richmond, Petty finished 3rd and Jarrett finished 5th, growing the gap to 168 points. At Manassas, Jarrett won the race while Petty finished 3rd, and the gap was closed to 153 points. At Hillsborough, Jarrett won the race while Petty finished 16th, and Jarrett took a chunk out of Petty's lead and was now 93 points behind. At Martinsville, Petty finished 2nd while Jarrett finished 5th, extending the gap to 108 points. At Savannah, Jarrett won the race while Petty finished 2nd, and the gap went back to 93 points. At North Wilkesboro, Petty finished 19th while Jarrett finished 29th, growing the gap to 119 points. At Charlotte, Petty finished 2nd while Jarrett finished 3rd, and the gap grew to 129 points. At Harris, Richard Petty would win the race while Jarrett finished 2nd, and the gap was now 144 points. At the penultimate race of the season in Augusta, Richard Petty would finish 25th, and this was a prime opportunity for Jarrett to close up. But despite leading 53 laps, he would disappoint and only managed a 19th place finish, and only got the gap down to 121 points. And with the field size in the finale at Jacksonville only being 25 cars, this would be a big enough gap for Richard Petty to lock up the championship a week early. So in 1964, we would have the best championship battle in the Pioneer era. But what absolutely killed Ned Jarrett was the race he did not participate in at Hickory. If he had participated in this race and finished the bare minimum of 17th, he would have gotten 112 points, and this would have been enough for him to clinch the title. And another thing is that no matter how close Jarrett got to Petty, Petty just shrugged it off and emerged as the title favorite every time, and because of this, Richard Petty walked away with his second consecutive championship. In 1965, we had 6 full-time drivers: Dick Hutcherson, Ned Jarrett, Bob Darrington, Cale Yarborough, Neil Castles, and G.C. Spencer. In the opening 11 races, only 2 full-time drivers won races. Ned Jarrett would win 3 races at Spartanburg, Weaverville, and Hillsborough, and Dick Hutcherson would win the race at Greenville. So after the opening 11 races, Ned Jarrett would lead the standings with a huge lead over Dick Hutcherson. Over the course of the next 11 races, Ned Jarrett would absolutely crush the rest of the opposition and would win 3 races at Hampton, Shelby, and Harris. And because of Ned Jarrett's dominance and just overall consistency, he now had a whopping 287-point lead over Dick Hutcherson. At race 23 in Nashville, Dick Hutcherson would take the win while Jarrett finished second, closing the gap to 272 points. At Birmingham, the roles would be reversed with Jarrett winning the race and Hutcherson finishing second, and the gap was reset to 287 points. At Hampton, Jarrett finished 3rd and Hutcherson finished 8th, stretching the gap to 315 points. At Nashville, Hutcherson would win the race while Jarrett finished 13th, decreasing the gap to 264 points. At Myrtle Beach, Hutcherson would go back-to-back and win his 2nd race in a row, while Jarrett finished 2nd, and the gap would shrink to 254 points. At Valdosta, Hutcherson finished 12th, while Jarrett finished 13th, closing the gap to 241 points. At Daytona, Hutcherson finished 19th and Jarrett finished 20th, slightly decreasing the gap to 238 points. At Manassas, Hutcherson finished 2nd and Jarrett finished 3rd, but due to Jarrett leading laps, the gap would flatline to 238 points. At Old Bridge, Hutcherson finished 2nd and Jarrett finished 5th, closing the gap to 223 points. At Islip, Hutcherson finished 2nd and Jarrett finished 3rd, shrinking the gap to 218 points. At Watkins Glen, Jarrett finished 3rd and Hutcherson finished 12th, and after 33 races, Hutcherson was still hovering around that 250-point buffer, and just couldn't seem to break through and convincingly beat Ned Jarrett. At Bristol, Jarrett won the race while Hutcherson finished 2nd, and the gap grew to 276 points. At Nashville, Jarrett finished 2nd while Hutcherson finished 15th, growing the gap to 328 points. At Shelby, Ned Jarrett would win the race while Hutcherson finished 3rd, decreasing the gap to 343 points. At Weaverville, Jarrett finished 2nd and Hutcherson finished 3rd, increasing the gap to 353 points. At Maryville, Hutcherson would stop the bleeding with a win, while Jarrett finished 6th, and the gap would close to 323 points. At Spartanburg, Jarrett would fire back with a win of his own, and Hutcherson would finish 9th, and the gap was now 360 points. At Augusta, Hutcherson would win the race while Jarrett finished 3rd, slightly closing the gap to 345 points. At Columbia, Hutcherson finished 3rd while Jarrett finished 7th, closing the gap to 316 points. At Moyock, Hutcherson won the race while Jarrett finished 2nd, decreasing the gap to 301 points. At Beltsville, Jarrett would win the race while Hutcherson finished 12th, growing the gap to 359 points. At Winston-Salem, Hutcherson finished 2nd while Jarrett finished 3rd, and now with 11 races to go, the gap was a whopping 354 points. With this gap, all Ned Jarrett needed to do was finish 5th or better in every race, and he would walk away the champion. At Darlington, Ned Jarrett would get off to a great start, winning the Southern 500 while Hutcherson finished 19th, and the gap was now 433 points, and that threshold would move down to 8th. At Hickory, Jarrett finished 3rd and Hutcherson finished 15th. The gap grew to 475 points, and the threshold moved to 10th. At New Oxford, Hutcherson would finally have a good race and win, while Jarrett finished 4th, slightly closing the gap to 450 points, and the threshold was now 9th. At Manassas, Jarrett finished 2nd while Hutcherson did not participate, and the gap was now 630 points. At Richmond, Jarrett finished 19th and Hutcherson finished 25th, extending the gap to 648 points. At Martinsville, Jarrett finished 4th while Hutcherson finished 6th, and the gap was now 658 points. And this would be enough for Jarrett to lock up the championship 5 races early, and Ned Jarrett would make a statement and win the season finale and put an exclamation point on a near perfect season. So in 1965, Ned Jarrett would finally claim that first championship in our timeline after 3 runner-up points finishes in 1961 to Rex White, in 1963 and 1964, both to Richard Petty. And after all that, Ned Jarrett would finally win his first championship in dominating fashion over Dick Hutcherson. In 1966, we had 9 full-time drivers: Richard Petty, J.T. Putney, John Sears, Wendell Scott, James Hilton, Elmo Langley, Neil Castles, David Pearson, and Henley Gray. In the opening 8 races, only 1 full-time driver would win a race. That driver was Richard Petty, winning 2 races at the season opener at Augusta and then the Daytona 500. But interestingly enough, Richard Petty was only able to get to 4th due to missing 3 races, and the points leader would be David Pearson with a whopping 276 point advantage over JT Putney. Over the course of the next 8 races, JT Putney would slowly be phased out of contention. Meanwhile, David Pearson would do nothing but dominate, winning 4 races in a row at Hickory, Columbia, Greenville, and Winston-Salem. And these dominant performances propelled David Pearson and took a commanding 340-point lead over 2-time champion Richard Petty. At Macon, David Pearson did not participate and Richard Petty won the race and was now 155 points behind. Fast forward 2 races to Richmond, where David Pearson would win the race while Petty would finish second, extending the gap to 165 points. At Charlotte, Pearson would finish 17th while Petty finished 22nd, growing the gap to 185 points. At Moyock, Pearson won the race while Petty finished 18th, growing the gap to 256 points. At Asheville, Pearson won again while Petty finished in 17th, increasing the gap to 324 points. At Spartanburg, Pearson finished a mediocre 16th while Petty did not participate, growing the gap to 439 points. At Maryville, Pearson would win the race while Petty once again did not participate, and this would result in Petty slipping back to 3rd, and now Elmo Langley would take 2nd, and he was now a gargantuan 567 points behind David Pearson. At Weaverville, Pearson finished 2nd while Langley finished in 11th, growing the gap to 612 points. At Beltsville, Langley finished 16th while Pearson finished 27th, closing the gap to 581 points. At Greenville, Pearson won the race while Langley finished 3rd, extending the gap to 601 points. At Daytona, Langley finished 13th while Pearson finished 15th, slightly decreasing the gap to 595 points. At Manassas, Langley would win the race while Pearson did not participate, taking a chunk out of Pearson's lead, and now the gap was 410 points. At Bridgehampton, Pearson would bounce back with a win while Langley finished 5th, growing the gap to 440 points. At Oxford, Pearson finished 7th while Langley finished 24th, growing the gap to 495 points. At Fonda, Pearson won the race while Langley finished 15th, and now, with 17 races to go, Langley needed nothing short of a miracle in order to catch Pearson. At Islip, Pearson finished 4th and Langley finished 5th, growing the gap to 567 points. At Bristol, Pearson finished 3rd and Langley finished 6th, growing the gap to 582 points. At Maryville, Pearson finished 2nd and Langley finished 26th, growing the gap to 676 points. At Nashville, Langley finished 17th while Pearson didn't participate, and the gap was now 564 points. At Atlanta, Langley finished 30th while Pearson finished 44th, shrinking the gap to 536 points. At Columbia, Pearson won the race while Langley finished 6th, growing the gap to 566 points. At Weaverville, Pearson finished 13th while Langley finished 22nd, extending the gap to 593 points. At Beltsville, Langley finished 2nd while Pearson did not participate, and now, with 9 races to go, Langley needed to make up at least 47 points per race. That's at least 7 positions every race. So Elmo Langley just simply needed a miracle in order to claim this championship. At Winston-Salem, David Pearson won the race while Langley finished 16th, growing the gap to 493 points. At the Southern 500 in Darlington, Pearson finished 3rd while Langley finished 18th, growing the gap to 554 points. At Hickory, Pearson won the race while Langley finished 12th, and Langley would slip back to 3rd, while John Sears would take 2nd place. He was now 611 points behind in 2nd, and Langley was 612 points back in 3rd. At Richmond, Pearson won again while Langley finished 5th, and Langley was now 642 points behind Pearson, and Sears had a miserable day, finishing 19th and was now 690 points back. And with this, David Pearson would clinch the championship 5 races early and write his name in the history books as the 1966 Cup Series champion. So either way, David Pearson would claim his first championship in 1966. David Pearson would dominate the season despite 4 other drivers making more starts than him. But Pearson would be so consistent that it wouldn't even matter, and because of this, David Pearson would walk away the 1966 champion. So in 1967, there were 7 full-time drivers: Bobby Allison, Richard Petty, John Sears, James Hilton, Jim Pascal, Elmo Langley, and Wendell Scott. In the opening 9 races of 1967, Richard Petty would win 2 races at the season opener at Augusta and then 5 races later at Weaverville. And Bobby Allison would win race 9 at Winston-Salem. So after the first 9 races, it would be a winless driver leading the points in James Hilton, leading with finishes of 4th, 5th, 9th, 3rd, 20th, 14th, 5th, and 5th. Over the course of the next 9 races, Richard Petty would win 4 of the next 9, and would be so dominant, having those 4 wins, 8 top 5s, and 9 top 10s in this span, and would result in Richard Petty taking a somewhat commanding 182-point lead over James Hilton. At Atlanta, Petty would win while Hilton would finish 3rd, growing the gap to 202 points. At the World 600 in Charlotte, Petty finished 4th while Hilton finished 9th, growing the gap to 224 points. At Asheville, Petty finished 3rd and Hilton finished 4th, slightly extending the gap to 229 points. At Macon, Petty won the race while Hilton finished 2nd, increasing the gap to 244 points. At Maryville, Petty won again while Hilton finished 7th, extending the gap to 283 points. At Birmingham, Petty finished 3rd and Hilton finished 4th, slightly growing the gap to 288 points. At Rockingham, Petty won again while Hilton finished 8th, growing the gap to 331 points. At Greenville, Petty won yet again while James Hilton did not participate, and the gap was now a whopping 511 points. At Montgomery, Petty finished 2nd and Hilton finished 5th, and now a little past the halfway point of the season, Richard Petty was in full control of the championship, and it would take nothing short of a miracle for anyone to catch Petty. At Daytona, James Hilton finished 8th while Petty finished 11th, closing the gap to 519 points. At Trenton, Petty won the race while Hilton finished 10th, growing the gap to 570 points. At Oxford, Petty finished 2nd while Hilton finished 3rd, growing the gap to 585 points. At Fonda, Petty won again while Hilton finished 5th, growing the gap to 615 points. At Islip, Petty would claim his 2nd straight win while Hilton finished 2nd, growing the gap to 620 points. At Bristol, Petty would claim his 3rd consecutive win while Hilton finished 5th, growing the gap to 650 points. At Maryville, Petty finished 2nd while Hilton finished 4th, slightly extending the gap to 660 points. At Nashville, Petty won the race while Hilton finished 2nd, growing the gap to 675 points. At Atlanta, Richard Petty finished a mediocre 17th, and this was a prime opportunity for James Hilton to make up significant ground. But James Hilton did his best Dallas Cowboys impression, sad times, and choked, finishing 25th, and now, with 13 races to go, Richard Petty could just go on cruise control and win the championship. But what no one was expecting was Richard Petty doing anything but cruising. Richard Petty would absolutely crush the field and would go on to win the next 10 races in a row, which is still a NASCAR Cup Series record to this day. And he would solidify the most dominant season in NASCAR history. And this dominant season for Richard Petty would result in him claiming his 3rd championship in this timeline. So 1967 would be nothing short of a spanking for the rest of the field at the hands of Richard Petty. And honestly, this comment is the perfect way to describe what Richard Petty did in 1967. A couple of interesting things from this season were that Richard Petty set records in almost every single category. 27 wins is a record that still stands to this day and will probably never be broken. 38 top 5s, still a record. 40 top 10s, also a record. 5,543 laps led that we know of, still a record. A 5.0 average finish, also a record. So in short, Richard Petty's 1967 season is the single most dominant season in NASCAR history. In 1968, there were 6 full-time drivers: defending champion Richard Petty, Elmo Langley, David Pearson, John Sears, Bobby Isaac, and Clyde Lynn. In the opening 8 races of the season, we would only have 2 full-time winners. Richard Petty would win 2 races at Race 2 in Montgomery and then at Race 8 in Hickory. David Pearson would also have 2 wins of his own and going back-to-back at Richmond and Bristol. So after the first 8 races of the season, Richard Petty would be at the top of the table by 75 points over David Pearson, with finishes of 2nd, 1st, 10th, 8th, 2nd, 17th, 6th, and 1st. Over the course of the next 8 races, David Pearson would miss a race and would fall a little behind in the championship race, while Richard Petty had some inconsistencies with 3 straight sub-top 10 finishes, and this would result in Bobby Isaac taking the points lead over the defending champion Richard Petty and the 1966 champion David Pearson. At Hampton, David Pearson won the race while Isaac finished second, and this moved Pearson into second, and now 20 points behind. Richard Petty finished the race in 6th and was now in 3rd, 28 points behind. At the World 600 in Charlotte, David Pearson finished 4th while Isaac finished 5th, closing the gap to 15 points. And Richard Petty finished a terrible 38th and was now 116 points behind in 3rd. At Asheville, Richard Petty bounced back with a dominant win, while Isaac finished 3rd and Petty was now 96 points back in 3rd. David Pearson finished a mediocre 21st and was now 80 points behind in 2nd. At Macon, Pearson bounced back with a win while Isaac finished 2nd, closing the gap to 70 points. Richard Petty finished 3rd and was now 101 points behind. At Maryville, Petty won the race while Isaac finished 14th, and this would move Petty into 2nd, 42 points behind. Meanwhile, Pearson finished 15th, slightly extending the gap to 73 points. At Birmingham, Petty won his 2nd straight race while Bobby Isaac finished 2nd, closing the gap to 27 points, while David Pearson was disqualified and was relegated to an 18th place finish. It was now 134 points back in 3rd. At Rockingham, none of the contenders had good days. Isaac was the highest finishing driver with a 24th place finish, while Petty finished 26th and was now 37 points back. And Pearson finished 30th and was now 152 points behind. At Greenville, Bobby Isaac had a terrible race, finishing 22nd, and this would hand the lead to Richard Petty, who won the race, and now halfway through the season, we had a 3-way title fight between the 2-time champion of Richard Petty and David Pearson and Bobby Isaac. At Daytona, David Pearson would finish 3rd while Richard Petty finished 21st, and Pearson closed the gap to 50 points in 3rd, and Bobby Isaac finished 8th and was now just 9 points behind Petty. At Islip, Pearson finished 2nd while Petty finished 4th, and Pearson was now 45 points back in 3rd, and Isaac finished 6th and was now 29 points behind in 2nd. At Oxford, Petty won the race while Pearson finished 2nd, and was now 55 points behind in 2nd. Bobby Isaac would finish 5th and would slip back to 3rd, 59 points back. At Fonda, Petty won again while Pearson finished 5th and was now 80 points back, while Isaac finished 4th and was now 84 points behind in 3rd. At Trenton, Pearson finished 2nd while Petty finished an abysmal 22nd, and Pearson closed the gap all the way to 7 points, while Isaac only managed a 16th place finish and was now 66 points behind. At Bristol, David Pearson dominated and won, while Petty finished 24th, and this handed the point lead to Pearson, and Petty was now 87 points behind in 3rd, while Bobby Isaac finished 4th and was now 2nd, 84 points back. At Maryville, Petty bounced back with a win while Pearson finished 4th, and Petty would move into 2nd, 62 points behind, while Isaac finished 22nd. It was now 147 points back. At Nashville, both Petty and Pearson scored the same amount of points while Isaac finished 4th, and now with 17 races to go in the season, the battle would come down to 3 drivers. Would it be Pearson claiming his 2nd championship in 3 years? Would it be Richard Petty claiming his 4th championship and going back-to-back? Or would it be Bobby Isaac claiming his maiden title? At Atlanta, Isaac finished 2nd while Pearson finished 4th, closing the gap to 157 points, while Petty finished 5th and was now 67 points behind in 2nd. At Columbia, David Pearson won the race while Petty finished 21st. It was now 152 points behind in 2nd. And Bobby Isaac finished 11th and was now 207 points back in 3rd. At Winston-Salem, Pearson and Petty scored the exact same amount of points, leaving the gap at 152 points, while Isaac finished 3rd, and he was now 222 points back. At Weaverville, Pearson won the race while Isaac finished 2nd. He was now 232 points behind in 2nd, while Richard Petty had a horrible race, finishing 26th, and was now 251 points back in 3rd. At South Boston, Petty would bounce back with a win, while Pearson finished 2nd, and Petty would shrink the gap to 236 points. And Isaac would hold 2nd with a 4th place finish, but was still 232 points behind. At Hampton, Pearson would take a commanding win while Petty finished second. It was now back to 251 points in second. Bobby Isaac finished third. It was now 252 points behind in third. At the Southern 500 in Darlington, Pearson finished a solid second while Petty finished 20th. It was now 318 points behind. While Isaac finished 33rd, it was now 355 points behind. At Hickory, Pearson won the race while Petty finished 4th and Isaac finished 2nd. And now with 9 races to go, David Pearson had a death grip on the championship. And now all he had to do was cruise to his second title. At Richmond, Richard Petty would win while Pearson finished second, slightly closing the gap to 323 points. And Bobby Isaac finished 6th, growing his gap to 380 points. It was now phased out of contention. At Beltsville, Petty finished 3rd while Pearson was disqualified for a second time this season, resulting in a 23rd place finish. It was now 252 points ahead of Petty. At Hillsborough, Petty won the race while Pearson finished 12th, taking another chunk out of Pearson's lead, and the gap was now down to 199 points. At Martinsville, Petty won again while Pearson finished 6th, and the gap was now 169 points. At North Wilkesboro, Petty won his 3rd consecutive race while Pearson finished 2nd and shrunk the gap to 159 points. At Augusta, Pearson would fire back with a win while Petty finished 3rd, growing the gap to 174 points. At Charlotte, David Pearson finished 2nd while Richard Petty finished an abysmal 32nd, and this would be the final nail in the coffin for Petty, because now Pearson had locked up the title 2 races early, and David Pearson would become a 2-time champion. So in 1968, David Pearson would claim his 2nd championship over Richard Petty, despite a huge late season charge from Petty. But you guys know that saying of, it's not the good days that make you a champion, it's the bad days. Well, that couldn't be more true for this season. Let's look at the stats. Both drivers have very similar stats, but the big one was DNFs. Pearson only had 10 DNFs and 2 disqualifications and missed a race. Meanwhile, Petty participated in every race, had 0 disqualifications, but he had 5 more DNFs this season, and that is ultimately why he lost the championship. In 1969, we had 6 full-time drivers. The Big Three would return with Bobby Isaac, Richard Petty, and the defending champion David Pearson, and the other 3 drivers would be Neil Castles, Elmo Langley, and James Hilton. In the opening 9 races, we would have 3 full-time winners, all of which were the 1968 season's Big Three. Richard Petty would win the season opener at Macon and would win another race at Riverside. David Pearson would win 3 races at the first Daytona qualifier, and then would go back-to-back at Rockingham and Augusta. And Bobby Isaac would win the other Daytona qualifier. So after the opening 9 races, Richard Petty would have the points lead over the defending champion David Pearson with finishes of 1st, 2nd, 1st, 6th, 8th, 5th, 2nd, and 7th. Over the next 9 races, Richard Petty would be able to hold his point lead, but he would be inconsistent and David Pearson would close the gap all the way down to just 6 points. At Beltsville, Richard Petty did not participate, and David Pearson would inherit the lead by 118 points over Petty. At Hampton, Pearson won the race while Petty once again did not participate and was now 298 points back. At Charlotte, Pearson finished an abysmal 42nd, and there would be a new 2nd place in James Hilton, who finished 3rd and was now 234 points behind. At Macon, Pearson finished 2nd, and now Bobby Isaac would claim 2nd and was now 247 points back. At Maryville, Isaac would win again while Pearson finished 2nd, and the gap was now 237 points. At Michigan, Pearson finished 2nd while Isaac finished 28th, and was now 330 points behind Pearson in 2nd. At Kingsport, Pearson finished 3rd and Richard Petty would move into 2nd with a win. It was now 322 points behind. At Greenville, Petty finished 3rd and Pearson finished 2nd. And now, after 27 races through the season and at the halfway point, the gap was now 332 points. At Daytona, Pearson finished 4th and Petty finished 5th, growing the gap to 347 points. At Dover, Petty won the race while Pearson finished 23rd, and the gap was now 261 points. At Thompson, Pearson would fire back with a win while Petty finished 25th, and the gap was now 353 points. At Trenton, Pearson would go back-to-back with a win and was now 394 points ahead of new 2nd place, James Hilton. At Beltsville, Pearson finished 2nd and Hilton finished third, growing the gap to 404 points. At Bristol, Pearson won the race while Hilton finished fourth. It was now 424 points back. At Nashville, Pearson finished sixth while Hilton finished third, and the gap was now 414 points. At Maryville, Pearson finished second while Hilton finished fifth, and the gap was now 434 points. At Michigan, Pearson won the race while Hilton finished ninth. It was now 522 points behind. At South Boston, Pearson finished second, and now Richard Petty would take second. It was now 529 points behind. At Winston-Salem, Petty won the race while Pearson finished third, and the gap was now 514 points. At Weaverville, Pearson finished second, and James Hilton took second back. It was now 562 points behind. At the Southern 500, Pearson finished second, and Richard Petty would move back into second. It was now 627 points back. At Hickory, Pearson finished 21st while Petty finished third. It was now 557 points behind. At Richmond, Pearson finished fourth and Petty finished 19th, and the gap was now 606 points. Fast forward 2 races to Columbia, Richard Petty finished second while Pearson finished 19th. And now, with 9 races to go, David Pearson could go on cruise control and win his 3rd championship. At Martinsville, Petty would win while Pearson finished second, and the gap was now 527 points. At North Wilkesboro, Pearson and Petty would score the exact same amount of points, and the gap was still 527 points. At Charlotte, Pearson finished 5th while Petty finished 27th, and the gap was now 593 points. At Savannah, the two would score the exact same amount of points again, and now Pearson had enough points to clinch the championship 5 races early and claim his 3rd championship in 4 years. Well, that was disappointing. I know a lot of comments I had on the 1968 video saying that this was going to be a great championship battle, but in the end it just wasn't. Pearson took the point lead at race 19 in Beltsville and just never gave it up, and walked away as the champion of 1969. Well, in 1970, we had 6 drivers of note: Bobby Allison, Richard Petty, Bobby Isaac, James Hilton, Neil Castles, and Elmo Langley. In the opening 8 races of 1970, we had 3 full-time winners. James Hilton would win race 5 at Richmond, Richard Petty would win 2 races at Rockingham and Savannah, and Bobby Allison would win race 8 at Atlanta. So after the first 8 races of the season, the 1969 runner-up Richard Petty was looking for redemption, and had the lead by 117 points over Bobby Isaac, with finishes of 5th, 6th, 39th, 2nd, 1st, and 5th. Over the course of the next 8 races, Richard Petty would maintain a healthy points lead over Bobby Isaac, but at the race in Darlington, Richard Petty would have a violent crash, resulting in a broken shoulder, and he would miss the next 6 races and would no longer be in contention. And with these unfortunate circumstances, Petty would fall down to 5th, and Bobby Isaac would be the one to inherit the points lead over James Hilton by 105 points. At race 17 in Maryville, Isaac would win the race, while Hilton finished second and was now 120 points behind. At Martinsville, Isaac would go back-to-back and win, while Hilton finished 7th, and the gap was now 159 points. At Michigan, Isaac finished 5th, while Hilton finished 8th, and the gap expanded to 177 points. At Riverside, Hilton finished 3rd, while Isaac finished 16th, and the gap was shrunk to 127 points. At Hickory, Isaac won the race while Hilton finished 13th, and the gap was now 188 points. At Kingsport, Hilton finished 2nd while Isaac finished 8th, and the gap was now 165 points. At Greenville, Isaac won the race while Hilton finished 4th, and the gap grew to 190 points. At Daytona, Isaac finished 9th while Hilton finished 7th. And now at the halfway mark of the season, Bobby Isaac was still at the top of the table by a sizable margin over James Hilton. At Malta, Hilton finished 6th while Isaac finished 17th, and the gap was now 154 points. At Thompson, Isaac won the race while Hilton finished 8th, and the gap was now 197 points. At Trenton, Isaac finished 19th while Hilton finished 5th, and the gap was now all the way down to 148 points. At Bristol, Isaac finished 3rd while Hilton finished 11th, and Hilton was now 183 points behind in 3rd. And Bobby Allison would move into 2nd and was now 168 points behind Isaac. At Maryville, Isaac finished second when James Hilton moved back into second with a 4th place finish and was now 198 points behind. Allison finished 17th and was now 231 points back in 3rd. At Nashville, Isaac won the race while Allison would move back into second with a 2nd place finish and was now 246 points behind. James Hilton finished 28th and was now 301 points back. At Atlanta, Bobby Isaac had a horrendous day, finishing 35th, and Allison finished 7th and was now 168 points back in 2nd. And Hilton finished 10th and was now 234 points back in 3rd. At Columbia, Bobby Isaac would bounce back with a win, and now with 16 races left in the season, Bobby Isaac and Bobby Allison would both be fighting for their first titles. At Ona, Isaac finished 10th and Allison finished 11th, and the gap was now 192 points. At Michigan, Allison finished 2nd while Isaac finished 4th, and the gap shrunk slightly to 182 points. At Talladega, Isaac finished 2nd while Allison finished 13th, and the gap grew to 228 points. At Winston-Salem, the two drivers scored the exact same amount of points, and the gap stayed at 228 points. At South Boston, Isaac finished 2nd while Allison finished 3rd, and the gap would grow to 233 points. At the Southern 500 in Darlington, Isaac finished 2nd while Allison finished 10th, and the gap was now 274 points. At Hickory, Isaac won the race while Allison finished 3rd, and the gap was now 294 points. At Richmond, Allison finished 2nd while Isaac finished 4th. And now with 8 races to go, Bobby Allison needed to make up at least 35 points per race on Isaac. But as for Bobby Isaac, all he had to do was finish 6th or better, and he would be crowned the champion of 1970. At Dover, Allison finished 2nd while Isaac finished 6th, and the gap shrunk to 264 points. At Raleigh, Isaac finished 2nd, Allison finished 4th, and the gap was now 274 points. At North Wilkesboro, Isaac won the race while Allison finished 4th, and the gap was now 294 points. At Charlotte, Allison finished 2nd and Isaac finished 5th, and the gap shrunk to 279 points. At Martinsville, Allison finished 2nd while Isaac finished 4th, and the gap was 269 points. At Macon, Isaac finished 2nd while Allison finished 4th, and the gap was now 284 points, which was now enough for Bobby Isaac to lock up the championship with 2 races to go. And to open the 1970s, Bobby Isaac would win his first championship. So in 1970, Bobby Isaac would dominate the season, and for Bobby Allison, he would have been more of a contender if he did not miss the 5th race of the season at Richmond. And if he hadn't missed this race, this championship battle could have been a little closer and maybe a little more entertaining. But again, what could have been? And another thing, Richard Petty could have won this championship. Hear me out. Richard Petty missed 7 races. When Petty got injured, he was leading the standings quite comfortably, and Petty had the same average finish as Bobby Isaac, and had 7 more wins despite having 7 less starts. But you know, what if? In 1971, we had 5 drivers worth mentioning. 1970 runner-up Bobby Allison, Cecil Gordon, Richard Petty, James Hilton, and Elmo Langley. In the opening 8 races, only one full-time driver won races, and that would be Richard Petty. Petty would win 4 races, the first coming at the Daytona 500, and then would go 3 in a row at Richmond, Rockingham, and Hickory. And after the first 8 races, to the absolute shock of no one, Richard Petty would have a commanding 211-point lead over James Hilton. Over the next 8 races, Richard Petty would win 4 races, and this would put him at 8 wins of his first 16 starts. That is simply unbelievable. Richard Petty would be so consistent, and after 16 races, Richard Petty now had a whopping lead of 435 points. At race 17 in South Boston, Petty finished 2nd and Hilton finished 3rd, extending the gap to 445 points. At Talladega, Hilton finished 7th and Petty finished 38th, and the gap shrunk all the way to 361 points. At Asheville, Petty bounced back with a win while Hilton finished 17th, and the gap was now back to 434 points. At Kingsport, Hilton finished 3rd while Petty finished 17th, and the gap shrunk to 386 points. At Charlotte, Petty finished 4th while Hilton finished 13th, and the gap was now 417 points. At Dover, Petty finished 3rd while Hilton finished 6th, and the gap grew to 437 points. At Michigan, Petty finished 6th while Hilton finished 12th. The gap extended to 460 points. At Riverside, Hilton finished 4th while Petty finished 13th, and halfway through the season, Richard Petty was definitely the championship favorite. And after the heartbreak of missing 7 races and missing out on a championship in the previous season, Richard Petty was looking for redemption in his 4th title. At Houston, Hilton finished 2nd and Petty finished 7th, and the gap shrunk slightly to 405 points. At Greenville, Petty won the race while Hilton finished 12th, and the gap was now 458 points. At Daytona, Petty finished 2nd while Hilton finished 9th, and the gap grew to 495 points. At Bristol, Petty finished 3rd while Hilton finished 5th, and the gap grew to 510 points. At Malta, Petty would submit himself as the number 1 driver on the season and go win on the next 4 races in a row. And now with 16 races to go, with a lock for the title with a massive 632-point lead over James Hilton. At Atlanta, Petty would win his 5th race in a row and now had a 679-point lead over Hilton. At Winston-Salem, Petty finished 2nd while Hilton finished 22nd, and the gap was now 757 points. At Ona, Petty won the race while Hilton finished 3rd, and the gap was now 777 points. At Michigan, Petty finished 2nd while Hilton finished 8th, and the gap was now 810 points. At Talladega, Petty finished 2nd while Hilton finished 5th, and the gap once again grew to 830 points. At Columbia, Petty won his 17th race of the season while Hilton finished 4th, and the gap grew to 855 points. At Hickory, Petty finished 3rd while Hilton finished 6th, and the gap grew to 870 points. At the Southern 500 in Darlington, Petty finished 2nd while Hilton finished 6th, and the gap was now 895 points. At Martinsville, Petty finished 3rd while Hilton finished 9th. The gap was now 927 points. And that gave Richard Petty enough cushion to lock up the championship 7 races early. And Richard Petty in this timeline was now a 4-time champion. So, what is there really to say about this season? Petty just simply dominated. This season was very reminiscent of his famous 1967 season, but in my opinion, this season is not talked about enough and is in my opinion a little underrated and overshadowed by his 1967 season. But nonetheless, Richard Petty would cap off the Pioneer era with his 4th championship. In 1972, we will look at 5 drivers: James Hilton, defending champion Richard Petty, Bobby Allison, Benny Parsons, and Cecil Gordon. In the opening 6 races of 1972, we had 2 winners. Richard Petty would win the season opener at Riverside and then would win again 2 weeks later at Richmond. And Bobby Allison would win the 6th race of the season at Atlanta. So after 6 races, Richard Petty and Bobby Allison were only separated by 13 points, with Petty having the edge, with finishes of 1st, 26th, 1st, 4th, 2nd, and 6th. Through the next 6 races, these 2 drivers would swap the points lead 3 times, but ultimately Bobby Allison would have a 45th place finish at Talladega, and that would give Richard Petty the point lead after 12 races by just 85 points. At Dover, Bobby Allison would win while Petty finished 2nd, and the gap shrunk to 75 points. At Michigan, Allison finished 2nd while Petty finished 3rd, and the gap shrunk slightly to 70 points. At Riverside, Petty would dominate early and lead the most laps, but had an engine failure and finished 23rd, while Allison finished 6th and the gap shrunk all the way down to just 19 points. At the Texas World Speedway, Petty bounced back with a win while Allison finished 2nd, and the gap grew to 29 points. At Daytona, Petty finished 2nd and Allison finished 3rd, and the gap grew slightly to 34 points. At Bristol, the 2 drivers would fight for the win, leading 496 out of 500 laps, with Allison coming out on top. And now, with 13 races to go in the season, Petty and Allison were separated by just 24 points, and already we had the closest championship battle in NASCAR history. At Trenton, Allison won the race while Petty finished 3rd, and the gap shrunk to 14 points. At Atlanta, Allison won his 3rd consecutive race and Petty finished 2nd, and now the gap was only 9 points. At Talladega, Allison finished 3rd and Petty finished 7th, and Allison would take the points lead by only 10 points over Petty. At Michigan, Allison finished 2nd while Petty finished 4th, and the gap grew to 20 points with Allison in the lead. At Nashville, Allison won the race while Petty finished second, and the gap grew to 30 points. At the Southern 500 in Darlington, Allison won the race and Petty finished third. And now, with only 7 races left in the season, Allison was on top by only 45 points. And this championship battle, for the first time since 1950, could go down to the final race. At Richmond, Petty won the race with Allison finishing second, and the gap shrunk to 35 points. At Dover, Petty finished second while Allison finished an abysmal 20th, and this would hand the points lead back to Richard Petty by 32 points with just 5 races to go. At Martinsville, the 2 drivers would finish 1 and 2 again with Petty on top, and the 2 would actually score the exact same amount of points, and the gap would remain at 32 points. At North Wilkesboro, the result would be the exact same, and the gap flatlined at 32 points with Petty on top. At Charlotte, Allison would bounce back with a huge win, and Petty only managed a 10th place finish, and Allison would take the point lead back by just 14 points with 2 races to go. At the penultimate race of the season at Rockingham, Allison would pull off another huge win while Petty finished second, and going into the finale, the 2 drivers were only separated by 24 points. And for the first time in 22 years, we had a championship battle go down to the final race, and all Allison would have to do was finish third if Petty gained max points. In the finale at the Texas World Speedway, Richard Petty was out in front almost all day, but he would inherit the powers of the postseason Dallas Cowboys and choke the win away and finish third, with Allison finishing right behind him in fourth. And with that, Bobby Allison would take down Richard Petty and walk away the champion of 1972. So, we had what has to be the greatest championship battle in history up to this point. Bobby Allison and Richard Petty were so close this season, and that made for one of the greatest championship battles ever. These 2 were so even in the stat sheet, but what ultimately gave Allison the edge was 2 more wins and 1 less DNFs. And despite the 2 drivers finishing 1-2 13 times throughout the season, and Petty winning the 1-2 battle 8-5, Allison's 2 more wins or what ultimately won Allison the championship, and would be the first time since 1963 that we had a different champion from real life. In 1973, we're going to take a look at 6 drivers: Benny Parsons, James Hilton, Cale Yarborough, Richard Petty, Buddy Baker, and Cecil Gordon. In the opening 5 races, we had 2 winners. Richard Petty would win the Daytona 500 and then go back-to-back by winning the next week at Richmond. And Cale Yarborough would win the 5th race of the season at Bristol. After the first 5 races of the season, Richard Petty narrowly held the point lead over Cale Yarborough, with finishes of 21st, 1st, 23rd, and 2nd. Over the course of the next 5 races, Richard Petty would have 4 DNFs and fall out of the point lead. Cale Yarborough would have 2 DNFs, and this would ultimately deny him the point lead, and the driver who took the lead would be Benny Parsons, who had 5 straight top 10s, 4 of which being top 5s, and only had a lowest finish of 6th. So after 10 races, Benny Parsons would have the point lead by 39 points over Cale Yarborough, and we would have 4 drivers in serious striking distance of the points lead. At Nashville, Parsons finished second while Yarborough dominated the race, and the gap shrunk to 29 points. At the World 600 at Charlotte, Parsons finished 5th while Yarborough finished 3rd, and now the gap was 19 points. With Buddy Baker winning the race, he was now just 52 points behind in 3rd. At Dover, Parsons finished 6th while Yarborough finished 2nd, and Yarborough would take the point lead by 6 points over Parsons. Baker finished 7th and was now 57 points back in 3rd. At the Texas World Speedway, Yarborough finished 4th while Parsons finished 7th, and Parsons is now 20 points behind. Baker finished 6th and was still 57 points back. At Riverside, Parsons finished 3rd while Yarborough finished a terrible 24th, and Buddy Baker would fall out of contention with a 38th place finish. And now, a little past the halfway point of the season, the battle was between Parsons and Yarborough. At Michigan, Yarborough finished 6th while Parsons finished 9th, and now the gap was just 42 points. At Daytona, Parsons finished 6th while Yarborough had an abysmal day, finishing in 36th, and the gap was now 137 points. At Bristol, Parsons won the race while Yarborough finished 19th, and the gap was now a whopping 211 points. At Atlanta, Yarborough bounced back with a second place finish while Parsons finished 25th, and now the gap was back down to 124 points. At Talladega, Yarborough finished 5th while Parsons finished a terrible 38th. And now, with just 8 races left in the season, Parsons and Yarborough were in a really tight battle. At Nashville, Parsons finished 19th while Yarborough finished 14th, and Yarborough would inherit the points lead by 5 points over Parsons. And Richard Petty, who finished second, was now only 65 points out of the lead. At the Southern 500 in Darlington, Yarborough won the race while Parsons finished 5th. It was now 35 points back in second. Petty finished 4th and was now 90 points behind in third. At Richmond, Petty won the race while Yarborough finished second. It was now 80 points back in third. Parsons finished 4th and was now 50 points behind in second. At Dover, Cale Yarborough would have a terrible day, finishing 25th while Parsons finished 4th, and took the points lead by 27 points over Yarborough. And Richard Petty finished 7th and was now 44 points behind in third. At North Wilkesboro, Parsons finished 5th while Yarborough finished 3rd. It was now only 12 points back in second. Petty finished 2nd and was now only 19 points behind in 3rd. At Martinsville, all 3 contenders had strong runs, but Cale Yarborough would take the points lead with a second place finish, by 7 points over Richard Petty, who won the race. And Benny Parsons was now 18 points behind in 3rd, with 2 races to go. At the penultimate race of the season at Charlotte, Cale Yarborough would have a strong win, while Petty finished 2nd, and Parsons finished 4th. And heading into the finale, the 3 drivers were only separated by 45 points. All Yarborough had to do was finish 2nd if Petty won the race. If Parsons was to win, he would have to gain max points to have Petty finish 5th and Yarborough finish 9th. So in the finale at Rockingham, we had a very anticlimactic finish to an awesome season. Benny Parsons got caught up in a wreck on lap 12, and he was automatically eliminated. Richard Petty had an engine failure a little before the halfway point of the race. And with Yarborough finishing 3rd, it's not like any of the other drivers really had a chance. So with that, Cale Yarborough would be the 1973 champion and clinch his first championship. In 1973, we had probably the greatest championship battle ever up to this point. The 3 drivers of Cale Yarborough, Richard Petty, and Benny Parsons were in the biggest dogfight for the title. These 3 drivers were so even. Look at the stats. But ultimately, in the end, Cale Yarborough's consistency is what won him this championship. Benny Parsons always had speed, but only won 1 race, and just did not consistently have race-winning pace. And Richard Petty was just too inconsistent earlier in the season, and that is why he didn't come away with a championship. And also, this now makes Cale Yarborough a 4-time champion in NASCAR, due to him winning the titles in this year, 1976, 1977, and 78, and now taking away Benny Parsons' 73 championship. In 1974, we'll take a look at 4 drivers: Richard Petty, defending champion Cale Yarborough, Dave Marcus, and Benny Parsons. In the opening 6 races of the season, 2 of the big hitters from last season would come out the gate swinging. Cale Yarborough would win the season opener at Riverside, and then 2 more times at Bristol and Atlanta. Richard Petty would take 2 wins of his own at the Daytona 500, and then again 2 races later at Rockingham. So after the first 6 races, Cale Yarborough and Richard Petty were unsurprisingly at the top, but Cale Yarborough would have the lead by 106 points over Richard Petty, with finishes of 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 2nd, 1st, and 1st. In the events of the next 6 races, Cale Yarborough and Richard Petty would be so consistent that in this time frame, both of them combined for a lowest finish of 14th. But the slight edge would go to Petty, who made a marginal gain, only shaving off 9 points, and Cale Yarborough would still have the points lead. At the World 600 at Charlotte, Richard Petty finished a solid 2nd while Yarborough finished a mediocre 11th, and the gap shrunk to 57 points. At Riverside, Yarborough would bounce back with a win, while Petty finished a disappointing 25th, and the gap was now 149 points. At Michigan, Petty would redeem himself with a win, while Yarborough would finish 27th, and the gap was back down to 51 points. At Daytona, Petty finished 2nd while Yarborough finished 4th, and the gap shrunk to 41 points. At Bristol, Yarborough won while Petty finished 3rd, and the gap grew to 56 points. At Nashville, Yarborough would win his 2nd consecutive race while Petty finished 13th, and with 12 races left in the season, Cale Yarborough seemed like a championship favorite. and Richard Petty's of a 5th championship were dwindling away. At Atlanta, Petty won the race while Yarborough finished 14th, and Petty was now firmly in the title fight, only 48 points back. At Pocono, Petty went back-to-back and won while Yarborough finished 3rd, and the gap was now 33 points. At Talladega, Petty won his 3rd straight race while Yarborough finished 4th, and the gap was now just 18 points. At Michigan, Petty finished 2nd while Yarborough finished 3rd, and the gap was shrunk slightly to 13 points. At the Southern 500 at Darlington, Yarborough would stop the bleeding with a win, while Petty finished an awful 35th, and all of Petty's good work was undone, and he was now 135 points behind with 7 races to go. At Richmond, Petty bounced back with a win while Yarborough finished 21st, and now, with 6 races left in the season, Yarborough and Petty were only separated by 55 points. At Dover, Petty won the race while Yarborough finished 28th, and for the first time all season, Yarborough was not in the points lead, and Petty now had the lead by 51 points. At North Wilkesboro, Yarborough won the race while Petty finished 2nd, and the gap shrunk to 41 points. At Martinsville, Yarborough finished 11th while Petty finished 29th, and Yarborough took the lead back by 23 points. At Charlotte, Petty finished 2nd while Yarborough finished 23rd, and Petty took the lead back by 53 points. At Rockingham, Yarborough would get in a massive battle with David Pearson, but got past with 40 to go and ultimately fell short and finished 2nd. Keep this in mind. In this race, Petty finished 3rd and the gap going into the finale was only 43 points. All Richard Petty had to do in the finale was finish 8th, and he would be the champion of 1974. In the finale at Ontario, Richard Petty and Kelly Yarborough both ran at the front all day, but Richard Petty had an engine failure with only 12 laps to go and would finish 15th, and this was a prime opportunity for Yarborough to take the title. But even with Yarborough having the lead with less than 40 to go, his car would fade and only manage a 3rd place finish, and this would be enough for Richard Petty to win the championship by 1 point over Cale Yarborough. So in 1974, Richard Petty would win his 5th championship, and he couldn't have done it in a more nail-biting fashion. Now remember the race at Rockingham? If Yarborough didn't finish 2nd and instead won, he would have won this championship. But instead, he choked that win away and heartbreakingly came up short. These two drivers were so close all season, but in the end, it just came down to consistency, and ultimately Richard Petty would walk away with the title. So with this video being the finale of the series, I think we should review. Now some things would change in the timeline of champions. NASCAR's inaugural season, it would go down to the wire between Red Byron, Bill Blair, and Lee Petty, and in the end, Byron choked at the finale at North Wilkesboro and Petty finished 2nd, and won the championship while Byron wouldn't be a champion. In 1950, Lee Petty and Bill Rexford were dueled out, but Lee Petty would be better and claimed the championship for his 2nd year in a row, and became NASCAR's first 2-time champion. In 1951, the battle would be between Fonty Flock and Herb Thomas, but would end with Flock locking up the title 1 week early and taking away Herb Thomas's 51 title. In 1952, Tim Flock and the now 2-time champion Lee Petty would duel it out, and Flock would get the better of him, winning the title 2 weeks early. In 1953, Herb Thomas would dominate the second half of the season, and it would result in him locking up the championship 4 races early. In 1954, Lee Petty and Buck Baker would get in a tight battle early on, but Petty would have a late season charge and end up claiming the championship a race early over Buck Baker and claim title number 3. In 1955, we seem to have a repeat of the 1954 season, with Petty and Baker going at it in the first half. But Tim Flock would put together an incredible second half charge and take the 1955 title a race early and claim his 2nd championship. In 1956, Buck Baker and Herb Thomas would be in a tight battle, but Buck Baker would put on a late season charge, winning 4 of the last 12 races, and would claim his first title a week early. In 1957, Fireball Roberts and Marvin Panch would be in a huge title fight, but the defending champion Buck Baker would put on a huge late season charge and win his 2nd consecutive championship. In 1958, Lee Petty started 6 more races than everyone else and ended up winning the title 12 races early. In 1959, the exact same song and dance would take place, and Lee Petty walked away with the championship 9 races early, and now had 5 titles to his name. In 1960, Lee Petty and son Richard Petty would duel it out early on, but Rex White would step in and pull away and win his first championship 2 races early. In 1961, defending champion and Ned Jarrett would be in a title fight, but White proved to have full control over the title and won the championship and took away Ned Jarrett's 1961 title. In 1962, Joe Weatherly and Jack Smith would be in the fight, but Smith would have some inconsistencies later in the season, and this would result in Joe Weatherly winning the championship. In 1963, Richard Petty and Ned Jarrett would fight for the championship, but Richard Petty was just overall better than Jarrett, and Richard Petty ended up winning the title. And what's funny about this season is that the real-life champion Joe Weatherly was not in a title talk all season long and ended up losing his 63 championship to Richard Petty, and this would be Petty's first title. In 1964, Petty and Jarrett would duel it out for the title, and this would be a dogfight all season long, but late in the season, Jarrett missed a race and it ultimately cost him the championship, and Richard Petty would go on and win his second title. In 1965, Ned Jarrett would finally get that first championship, and did it in dominating fashion, locking up the championship 5 races early. In 1966, David Pearson would dominate the season and ended up winning the title 5 races early. In 1967, well, it's Richard Petty in 1967. Do I need to say more? In 1968, David Pearson, Richard Petty, and Bobby Isaac would have a huge 3-way battle, but David Pearson would prove to be just a little bit better, and despite having a late season charge by Petty, Pearson would claim his second title in 3 seasons. In 1969, David Pearson would assert his dominance in the late 60s and won the championship 5 races early, and this would be his 3rd title in 4 years. In 1970, Bobby Isaac and Bobby Allison would be in a semi-close battle, but in the end, Bobby Isaac would pull away and win his first championship 2 races early. In 1971, Richard Petty would revert back to his 1967 form and dominate the season, winning 21 of 48 races, locking up the title 7 races early in the process. In 1972, the modern era would start, and Richard Petty and Bobby Allison would be in a huge championship battle, and for the first time since 1950, the championship was decided in the final race, and it ended in Allison claiming his first title and took away Richard Petty's 1972 championship. In 1973, Cale Yarborough, Richard Petty, and Benny Parsons. These 3 would duel it out all season long, and in the final race, Parsons would get in a wreck early, and Petty had an engine failure, and ended up handing Cale Yarborough his first championship. And as we covered today, Petty would win the 1974 title in dramatic fashion over Cale Yarborough. So here's how the title sheet looks right now with the real-life champions. This is how the title sheet changes with the rewriting history champions. Yeah, I know, quite the difference. Now, one thing I don't think a lot of people realize about the Pioneer era is how uncompetitive it was. In 23 years, there were only 2 titles that went down to the final race, and those were the first 2 seasons in 1949 and 1950. And in the next 23 years, the title went down into the race 14 times. In the Pioneer era, which spans from 1949 to 1971, the average margin of victory for the championship was 503 points. In the modern era, which I will be counting from 1972 to 2010, and yes, with no chase or anything, the average was only 160. Thank you to everyone who's made it this far, and also thank you for your support of not only this series but the channel as a whole. We now have over 2,700 subscribers, which is insane to me. Thank you guys. Anyway, that's going to do it for today, guys. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe. I'm trying to hit 4,000 by the end of the year. Comment, follow me on Instagram. Thank you to my channel members, and I will see you guys next week for another video. Y'all have a good one.